Welcome, dear listener. Gather close for tonight's tale from Middle-earth. There is much to tell, and the road we shall walk together winds long and shadowed, past the eldest darknesses of the world and into the deep places that even the wise of Gondor scarcely dared to name. So come, take your seat by whatever hearth you have, and lend me your ear, for this is a tale that asks only your listening. And before we go further, dear listener, a small and gentle word. If these long tellings from the old world are dear to you, and if you would have more of them in the days and weeks to come, then consider subscribing to this small corner of the wood, and ringing the little bell beside, that you might be summoned again when next we sit together by candlelight. It is asked only once, and only kindly. Now, on with the tale. Tonight, dear listener, we walk together through the long bestiary of Middle-earth, from the eldest horrors of the first dark, before the world was even fully shaped, down to the small terrors that lingered into the late Third Age. We shall speak of spirits that wore fire as a cloak, of spiders older than the stars, of dragons whose wings darkened the sun, and of orcs bred in the lampless pits of the north. We shall trace each kind back, so far as the law allows, to the place and the hour of its making, and to understand any of them, dear listener, we must begin where they all began, with the breaking of the great music itself. Now, before there was sun or moon, before the seas were laid down or the mountains lifted, before any green thing had ever pushed up through any soil, there was only Ilúvatar, the One, whom the elves named in their own tongue, and whom we may simply call the Father of all. And of his own thought he made first the Ainur, the Holy Ones. Spirits sprung from his mind as sparks leap from a forge. To each of them he gave a part of his own understanding, some greater and some lesser, but to each a gift and a knowing peculiar to that spirit alone. And these Ainur, dear listener, dwelt with him in the timeless halls beyond the world, for the world had not yet been spoken into being. And he taught them music, not the small music of our pipes and harps, but a music vast and theological, a music that was itself the shape of all things that might come to be. He gave to each Ainu a theme, a motif, a measure of his own thought, and he bade them sing, first alone, that each might learn his own voice, and afterward together, that they might learn one another. And so they sang, and the halls of his dwelling were filled with a sound such as had never been, and shall not come again, the high voices and the deep, the bright and the sombre, all woven into a single great chord that was the design of everything that should ever be. Yet among the Ainur, dear listener, there was one who was given the greatest portion of all, the mightiest in knowledge and in power, and his name in those first days was Melkor, he who arises in might. And because he was so great, and because to him had been given understanding of many of the gifts of his brethren as well as his own, he began in his solitary hours to seek out things that were not yet, things that had not been given to him in the theme. He went often, the old tellings say, to the empty places beyond the dwelling of Ilúvatar, into the void where as yet there was nothing, hoping to find there the flame imperishable, the secret fire that alone could kindle a thing into true being. But the flame was with Ilúvatar, and not to be found apart from him, and Melkor's seeking was vain, and his seeking grew bitter, and in his bitterness he began to nurse a thought of himself as separate from the rest, and from his father as well. So when the great music came at last to its second and its third themes, when the chord of all the Ainur was rising toward its fullness, Melkor wove into the singing a sound of his own, a melody that did not belong to the design Ilúvatar had given. It was not at first an ugly sound, it was loud and proud, and full of his own glory, and many of the Ainur near him faltered in their own parts and were drawn into his, and began to sing his thought rather than the thought of the One. And the great music, dear listener, was troubled. The harmony bent and warred against itself, and in places it became a clamour, a war of sounds where before there had been only the marriage of voices. Twice did Ilúvatar raise his hand and bring forth a new theme into the singing, that the discord of Melkor might be answered. The second of these themes was sad and beautiful, and ran beneath the discord like a river beneath a storm, and the discord could not silence it. And the third theme was deeper still, slow and majestic and beyond the power of any single Ainu to overmatch. And Melkor's clamour strove with the third theme as it had striven with the others, but the third theme drew his very strife into itself, weaving it as a darker colour into a tapestry already woven, so that even the malice of Melkor became, against his will, a part of the design of Ilúvatar. For so it was, and so it ever has been, dear listener, that nothing can be made or thought in opposition to the one, but that the one folds it, in the end, into a glory greater than the maker of evil ever intended. And when the music was ended, Ilúvatar took the Ainur to the edge of the void, and he showed them what they had sung. He gave them a vision of a world, round and green and full of seas, and in that world the slow unfolding of all that their singing had foretold, the rising of mountains and the kindling of stars, the coming of two kindreds whom he had not revealed to them in their singing, the elves first and men after them, his children, whom he had set as a secret melody of his own into the second theme. And the Ainur loved the vision, each according to the part he had sung, and they desired greatly that it should be made real and not only seen. So Ilúvatar spoke a single word, Ea, which means simply let it be. And the flame imperishable went forth from him into the void, and the world began. And many of the Ainur descended into the world to shape it and to tend it. The greatest of these were called the Valar, the powers of the world, and the lesser of their order were the Maiar, the servants and helpers of the Valar, each Maiar kindred in spirit to one or another of the great powers. And among the Maiar, dear listener, were spirits of fire and spirits of water, spirits of the deep forests and spirits of the high winds, spirits who would in later days take such names as Olorin and Curunir, names that you know better perhaps as Gandalf the Grey and Saruman the White. Of that high company were the wizards, sent late and in disguise into the Third Age. Of that same high company also, in their first making, were the Balrogs. For Melkor, dear listener, came down into the world too, and he came not as a healer or a tender, but as a claimant, intending to seize Arda for his own dominion. And he had not come alone. The Ainur whom he had drawn into his discord in the music had not been redeemed by the third theme. They had been overmatched, but not redeemed, and many of them descended with him, lesser spirits of the same order as those who would later serve the good Valar, but already curved away from the design they had been given. These were the first of the corrupted Maiar, the spirits who in time, clothed in the matter of the world, would become the Balrogs of his army, and chief among the latecomers of his servants there would come also the spirit who is named in our tales by his fairer name, the spirit who would in the long after days be called Sauron. So even before the lamps of the Valar were kindled, dear listener, before the first dawn ever broke over the young world, the seed of evil was already in the soil. And it is worth pausing here a moment before we walk further to set this thought clearly in your mind, for it is the key that unlocks every door in the long bestiary that follows. Whenever you hear, in the tales to come, of some new horror crawling out of the north, some new shape of cruelty striding from the pits, remember that none of these were called into being out of nothing. None of them were imagined by a mind that could imagine. They were all of them, every last one, the bending of something that had been good in its first making, the souring of something that had been sweet in its first design. The fair waters of the music had been muddied at their source, and from that muddied stream came every dreadful thing. And this is the deepest matter to grasp, before we name a single beast or count a single fang, that evil, in Tolkien's telling, is never a making of its own. It is always a marring, a twisting, a souring of something that was first made fair. Melkor could not create. None of his servants could create. They could only take what Ilúvatar had made and bend it from its true shape, mock it, pervert it, and so produce the monstrous things that haunt this bestiary. The Balrogs were once high spirits of flame, beautiful in the first music, and they became fire wraiths of cruelty. The dragons were drawn out of the matter of Maiar spirits and the substance of the world. But they were imitations, not new kinds. borrowings of what was, twisted into what should not be. The trolls were a heavy mockery of the Ents, the great tree shepherds whom the Vala Yavanna brought into the world, just as the orcs would in time be a mockery of the elves. Even Ungoliant, of whom we shall speak presently, though she came from the outer darkness and not from the music of the Aina as the Balrogs did, was nonetheless a perversion of hunger and need, an inversion of the appetite that the One had set into living things for the sustaining of their lives. Evil in Middle-earth, dear listener, is always parasitic. It feeds upon the good. It cannot stand alone. Think upon it, dear listener, for it changes how one looks upon any monster in any of the old tales. A Balrog is not simply a beast of flame. A Balrog is a high singer of the first music, gone wrong. A dragon is not simply a great fireworm. A dragon is fire that once warmed and now devours, a making of the world's own substance bent to a purpose the substance never asked to serve. A troll is not simply a brute. A troll is the slow, patient strength of stone given a cruel and hating shape. Even the orc, lowest and most numerous of the foot soldiers of the dark, is not, in his deepest origin, a thing that should have been. He is a thing that was once otherwise, and was broken. There is in every monster of Middle-earth, when you look at it long enough, a kind of ruin, a half-remembered glory beneath the cruelty, like an old fair carving worn down and defaced almost beyond recognition, but with here and there a curve or a line that still tells of the hand that first made it. And the sorrow of Tolkien's whole legendarium, dear listener, lies in that defacement. The tragedy is not that there is evil. The tragedy is that the evil was once something else. And from this great truth, dear listener, there come the four broad kinds of evil creature that haunt the long tale of Middle-earth, and it is well to set them in your mind now, before we walk among them, one by one. The first kind are the corrupted Maya, high spirits of the Holy Order, who fell with Melkor and were clothed at last in cruel forms. The Balrogs are of this kind, and Sauron himself is of this kind, and so too, in his own dread shape, was the spirit who would in the long ages after be known by other names still. The second kind are the bred monsters, creatures made by long and lampless cruelty in the pits of Utumno and afterward Angband, from the substance of other living things, by torments and breedings, whose particulars the lore-masters scarcely wish to set down. The dragons are of this kind, born of fire and the substance of spirits, and the cruelty of Morgoth's craft. The trolls are of this kind, and so are the great wolves, and the wargs that came after. The third kind are the twisted lineage horrors, creatures whose stock began as a free kindred of Ilúvatar, but who were captured and broken over long ages until something new and terrible had been made of them. Of this kind, in the older telling, are the orcs themselves, drawn, is said, from elves taken at Cuivinen and shaped in slow torment into a wholly fallen race. And the fourth kind, smallest in number, but perhaps eldest in dread, are the ancient unfathomed spirits, beings that came from the void itself, from outside the music altogether, whose origins not even the wise of the Valar could fully trace. Ungoliant was of this kind. The Watcher in the Water, perhaps, was of this kind. And there were nameless things that gnawed the roots of the world, of whom even Gandalf the Grey, who came face to face with one of them under the mines of Moria, would say only that they were older than Sauron, older than the orcs, older than any tale he himself had ever heard. So now, dear listener, with the design of evil set before us, the great music, the discord of Melkor, the descent of the corrupted ones, the marring rather than the making of every dreadful kind, we may begin to walk the bestiary itself. And we shall begin not with the children of Morgoth's pits, but with one who was older even than Morgoth's most ancient works, a being who came from the outer dark and who came already hungry. Her name was Ungoliant. Now Ungoliant, dear listener, is among the most mysterious of all the creatures in Tolkien's lore, for she is one of those whose origin even the lore masters of the elves could not fully explain. Some have said that she too was a mire of high order, a great spider. But the older tellings, and the tellings that Tolkien himself seemed in his later days to favor, set her apart from the host of the corrupted Ainur. They name her instead as a spirit out of the void, a thing that came from the outer dark before the world's making, drawn perhaps by the very promise of substance to be devoured. And so when she came at last into the world, she came already ancient, already shaped by hungers that had nothing to do with the holy music. She was not a fallen sister to Gandalf and Sauron. She was something other. She dwelt for an age in the south of Aman, the blessed realm itself, in a deep place called Avathar, a cleft between the high walls of the Pelori and the sea, a place where the light of the two trees of Valinor could not reach. And there she wove webs of a darkness that was not merely the absence of light, but a substance in itself, a darkness that drank light and grew stronger by it. She was vast even then, dear listener, larger than the great spiders of the late ages can give you any picture of, a swollen, bloated thing whose belly was never filled, who fed upon whatever stray creature wandered into her cleft, and whose body grew even as her hunger grew, for in her the eating only sharpened the wanting. And there it was that Melkor found her, in the days when he had escaped from the chains of the Valar and was plotting his great theft from Valinor itself. He sought her out because he knew that he alone could not pass the watchful gaze of the Valar, but that her web of darkness might cloak him. And he made with her a bargain, dark and unbalanced, for he promised her whatever her hunger might desire, and she, for her part, agreed to come with him to the high place of the two trees, and to do there what only she could do. So together they crept up the slopes of the Pelori, and Ungoliant spun about them both a cloak of her unlight, so thick that even the eyes of the Valar could not pierce it. And they came to the mound of Ezelohar, where stood the two trees of Valinor, Telperion of the silver light and Laurelin of the gold, the very source of light in that age before sun or moon were made. And Melkor with his black spear struck deep into each tree in turn, piercing the very bark and bole, and the bright sap of the trees ran out, as if it were blood. And Ungoliant, with her dreadful mouth, set herself to the wounds, and she drank. She drank the light of the trees. She drank the running sap of Telperion, and she drank the running sap of Laurelin, and she drank until both trees were drained and withered, until they stood only as dead grey shapes against the swiftly falling dark. And still she was not full. The light that had nourished a whole land could not satisfy her. She grew greater by the drinking, taller, more swollen, more dreadful, and yet her hunger only sharpened. And so it was that the two trees of Valinor perished, dear listener, and the light of the first age went out of the world, never to be wholly recovered. And afterward, when Melkor and Ungoliant had fled from the blessed realm and crossed the grinding ice into the north of Middle-earth, she turned upon her ally. For the Silmarils of Fëanor, the three great jewels in which a portion of the light of the trees had been preserved before their slaying, were now in Melkor's keeping, and her hunger demanded them too. She caught him in her web, and she would have devoured him and the Silmarils together, but he gave forth the great cry that is named in the old tellings the cry of Lammoth, and the Balrogs heard it from the deeps of Angband, and they came in wrath of fire, and their flaming whips drove Ungoliant away. So she fled, swollen and unsatisfied, southward into the lands that would in later ages be called Beleriand, and she came at last to a region in the south of that land, and there she dwelt for an age. And there, dear listener, she bred. She took for mates the lesser dark spirits of that region, or perhaps she required no mate at all, the law being uncertain, and she brought forth a brood, and her brood went out from her cleft and spread over the lands, and they were the ancestors of all the great spiders that haunt Middle-earth in the later ages. Of her line was Shelob, the great spider of the pass above Minas Morgul, whom you may know already from other tellings, who lay in wait for Frodo upon the stairs of Cirith Ungol, and of her line, in their lesser way, were the spiders of Mirkwood, the dark and clever ones who bound Thorin's company in webs in the wood of the great forest. All of them, dear listener, all the eight-legged horrors of the long ages, traced their making back to the unfathomed mother out of the void, who came into the world hungry and never ceased to hunger, until at last, the old tales say, she devoured even herself. And mark well, dear listener, that strange ending, for in it lies the deepest sermon of Ungoliant's whole long life, a hunger that cannot be satisfied by any outward feeding turns. In the end, inward, the mouth that will not stop biting must bite itself at last. So perished the eldest of the dark mothers, swallowed by her own unfilling want, somewhere in the lightless south of a land that was itself, in the breaking of the world, to be drowned beneath the cold sea. So we leave her there, in the bitter shadow of her own cleft, and turn our walking now to those who were her allies in that one dreadful hour at the mound of Azelohar, the Balrogs of Morgoth, the fire wraiths of the deep places. Now the Balrogs, dear listener, were not bred and were not born. They were not, like the dragons or the orcs, made things, shaped from other matter by long cruelty. They were spirits, Maiar of the same high holy order as Gandalf the Grey, as Saruman the White, as the wizards Radagast and Alatar and Palando, and indeed of the same order as Sauron himself. In the first music of the Ainur, before the world was made, they had sung their parts beside the bright spirits who would in later days serve the good Valar. They were spirits of fire, in the main, and their making was a making of brightness, and had things gone otherwise they might have become the kindest tenders of hearth and forge in the new world. But they were drawn, in those first themes of the great music, into the discord of Melkor. They were lesser in might than he was, but they were near to him in their love of flame and of power, and his proud counter-melody was sweet to their ears. And when at last the music ended and the descent into the world began, they came down with him into the world, already half his, already turned aside from the design they had been given. And in the long ages before the lamps were kindled, in the first stronghold of Melkor that was called Utumno far in the cold north, he wrought upon them with his arts and his persuasions, and he bound them more closely to himself, until they were no longer Maiar who served Melkor by choice. They were Maiar who could no longer have chosen otherwise. And they clothed themselves, in those ages, in shapes of terror. For the Ainur had been given the power, when they entered the world, of taking visible bodies, and a spirit's chosen body was a kind of reflection of its own heart. The good Maiar took for themselves forms of grace, fair shapes of elf-kind or mankind, or the shape of an old man with a staff, as Gandalf wore in his coming. The Balrogs, dear listener, chose otherwise. They wrapped themselves in flame as in a cloak, and they took for their bodies great forms taller than any man, dark-bodied beneath the cloaking fire, with shadow gathered about them as a second garment beneath the first, so that the eye looking upon a Balrog could scarcely tell where the flame ended and the shadow began. And they were armed. They bore in their right hands whips of many flaming thongs, whose cracking lashes left burning wheels upon stone itself, and many of them bore also great swords of red iron that smoked even in the cold air, and some, the old tales say, carried black axes whose biting was as cruel as the whips, and they dwelt in the deep places, dear listener. When Utumno was at last broken by the Valar in the war that overthrew Melkor in the very first age, the Balrogs hid themselves in the lowest vaults, and they were not all slain. And when Melkor returned, freed at last from his long captivity, and now bearing the new and dreadful name of Morgoth, he raised up Angband, the Hells of Iron, in the north of Middle-earth, and the Balrogs came up to him out of the deep places and rallied to his standard. They became the captains of his armies. They went forth in the great battles of the wars of Beleriand, and where they came no warrior of the free peoples could long stand against them. For they were not merely beasts of flame, but spirits of an order higher than any elf or man, with the wits and wills of fallen Ainur. How many of them were there, dear listener? The lore is vague. In the older writings, Tolkien spoke of Balrogs as a numerous host, hundreds perhaps, a great corps of fire spirits at Morgoth's call. But in his later writings, in the careful trimming of his old age, he revised his estimate sharply downward, suggesting that there had been at most only 7 Balrogs in all the world. 7, he said, was perhaps the number, for the corrupting of a mire was a great work even for Morgoth, and not lightly done, and there could never have been so many fire spirits in his service as the early tellings supposed. Whether 7 or some other number, dear listener, they were few. They were precious to him. He did not spend them lightly. Their captain, the greatest of all the Balrogs, was named Gothmog, and he bore the title of Lord of Balrogs, the High Marshal of all the fiery host. He was tall and dreadful even among his own kind, and his deeds in the wars of Beleriand were many and grim. It was Gothmog, in the great battle of the unnumbered tears, who came upon Fëanor, the very Fëanor who had wrought the Silmarils, the proudest and most gifted of all the elves who ever lived, and Gothmog with his flaming sword struck Fëanor down, and the spirit of the great craftsman departed in a burning of so fierce a heat that his body fell to ash, and his sons could not even bear away his bones for burial. And later, in another battle still, Gothmog slew Fingon, the High King of the Noldor, beating him to his knees with a great black axe, and then cleaving him through. Such was the captain of the Balrogs, dear listener, not merely a beast but a slayer of kings, and the Balrogs went forth in many battles, and many of them in time were slain. The mightiest of the elf lords learned, at terrible cost, that a Balrog could be brought down. Ecthelion of the Fountain, of the hidden city of Gondolin, slew Gothmog himself in the sack of that city, though Ecthelion fell with him in the same drowning. Glorfindel of the Golden Flower, of that same fair city, faced a Balrog upon the high pass of the mountains as the survivors of Gondolin fled. And they fought upon the cliff edge and toppled together into the abyss, and Glorfindel too perished, though he was sent back in later days into the world for his valor. And in the War of Wrath, the last and greatest of the wars against Morgoth, the host of the Valar themselves came at last over the sea, and in that war almost all the Balrogs that remained were destroyed, hunted down, and slain by the Maiar of the Good Order who came in might with the Valar Enwi. Almost all, dear listener, for there were a few, perhaps only one, perhaps a small handful, who in the breaking of Angband fled into the deepest delvings of the world, into root passages beneath the mountains that even Morgoth had not made, but had only discovered, and there they hid themselves. And they slept. They slept the long sleep of fallen spirits, dwelling in the lightless deep places where the dwarves had not yet come, and the world above them passed through whole ages, the long Second Age, the founding of Númenor and its drowning, the rise of Sauron, the forging of the rings, and still in the deep places one of these last Balrogs slept on, until in the Third Age the dwarves of Khazad Diem, delving too greedy and too deep for the precious mithril, struck at last upon his hiding place, and what was awakened there, what came forth in fire and shadow into the great halls of the dwarf realm, you know already, dear listener, by another name. They called it the Bane of Durin. They called it, in their fear, simply Durin's Bane. And it was a Balrog of Morgoth, a fire spirit of the First Dark, sleeping 1,000 years deep beneath the world, and waked at last by a pickaxe. But of that meeting, and of Gandalf upon the bridge, we shall not speak tonight, for it belongs to other tales. Tonight we only mark that the last of the Balrogs lingered, dear listener, into the latest age of all, and that is the way of things from the First Dark. The marring outlasts the maker. Long after Morgoth himself had been cast out beyond the walls of the world, his fire spirits still slumbered in the deep places of the world he had spoiled, and the patient stone above them kept its silence, knowing nothing of what it held beneath. Whole peoples rose and built their kingdoms over those sleeping fires, never guessing what slept below. The dwarves of Khazad DM delved their bright halls of mithril and silver scarcely a mile above the chamber where Durin's bane lay coiled in its long dream, and they prospered for an age in their ignorance, and the bell of their forges rang above the sleeper's head, and the sleeper did not stir. Such is the cunning of evil, to wait, to outlast not only its makers, but its enemies, and its rememberers alike. So we leave the Balrogs in their hiding, and turn now to another kind of horror that Morgoth bred in those same first ages, a kind not of corrupted Maiar, but of made things. The dragons. The first of the great dragons, dear listener, the eldest of them all, was Glaurung, and he was called the father of dragons, for from him in long descent came all the worms and serpents that haunted the later ages. He was not a Maiar, as the Balrogs were. He was a bred thing, and his breeding was the long work of Morgoth, in the deepest forges of Angband, where the Dark Lord wrought upon the substance of fire and the substance of the great worms of the earth, and bound also into the making, the old tales hint, some portion of the spirits of fallen Maiar, lesser even than the Balrogs, small dark spirits who lent to the dragons their cunning and their dreadful speech. So a dragon, dear listener, was not merely a vast lizard with a furnace in its breast. A dragon was a beast with a mind, a beast with a voice, a beast whose gaze could bind the will of any creature who looked too long into its eyes. There was an evil spirit inside the great body, and that is what made the dragons of Morgoth so very terrible. Glaurung came forth first of his kind in the wars of Beleriand, while he was yet young and not full grown. He was at that hour a wingless creature, for the winged dragons would not be made until the very last hour of the war, and he was a creeping thing, vast and worm-like scaled in gold, with a long sinuous body and clawed feet, who slid across the earth with a sound like a great wind in dry grass. The elves drove him back into Angband on that first coming, for he was not yet at his full strength. And Morgoth was wroth at his early sending, and kept him hidden in the deep furnaces for many a long year afterward, that he might come to his full power before he came forth again. And when at last Glaurung came forth again, dear listener, he was grown into his full might, and there was no creature of the free peoples that could stand against him. He came forth in the great battle that is called Dagor Bragollach, the Battle of Sudden Flame, and he led the legions of Morgoth across the plain of Ardgalen, and the plain was burned away beneath the breath of his furnaces, and a green land became a desert in a single hour. He was then the chief weapon of Morgoth, and where he came whole armies broke before him, and the Noldor of the high kingdoms lost in that battle realms that they would never recover. And then came the matter of Trin, dear listener, which is the saddest tale in all the elder days, and the matter of Trin is bound to the matter of Glaurung, for the dragon and the man stalked each other's lives for many long years. When the hidden kingdom of Nargothrond at last was uncovered to Morgoth's spies, Glaurung was sent against it, and he came down upon the high doors of that kingdom, and broke them in, and he sacked Nargothrond utterly. And it was at the sack of Nargothrond that Trin, the wandering hero, came at last face to face with the dragon, and Glaurung, with the great spell of binding that was peculiar to his kind, cast his eyes upon Trin, and held him fast upon the stone where he stood. He could not move, he could not lift his sword. He could only stare into the lidless gold eyes of the dragon, while the dragon spoke to him in a voice slow and soft, and full of poison. And the dragon mocked him, and laid upon him false guilts and false counsels, and bent his mind in the working of that one terrible conversation, so that all the later sorrows of Trin's life, and they were many, dear listener, and they were dreadful, flowed in part from the wounds laid upon his mind in that single hour. For such was the power of the great dragons. They did not need to bite or burn to destroy you. They could undo you with a single conversation, if you were unwary enough to listen. They lied with such craft, and they wove together truth and falsehood with such cunning, that even the wise could not always tell the color of what they had been told. The dragon's voice was in many ways more dangerous than the dragon's flame, and it was Trin in the end, after long wanderings and longer sorrows, who slew Glaurung. He came upon the dragon at a gorge of the river Teiglin, a deep cleft in the land called Cabed en Arras, where the dragon was crossing in his great bulk from one side to the other. And Trin lay hidden beneath the lip of the gorge, and as Glaurung passed over him, he drove upward with the black sword Gurthang, the iron of which had been forged from the iron of a fallen star, and he drove the blade up to the hilt into the soft belly of the dragon, and Glaurung roared so loud that the very stones cracked, and his blood ran out boiling and burned Trin's hand when the blade was drawn forth, so that Trin fell back in a swoon. And Glaurung crawled away dying, and lay at the lip of the gorge, and there in his dying he opened his eyes one final time upon Ninna, Trin's sister, and laid upon her the last cruelty of his life, which was to take from her the memory of her own name and her own people. So passed Glaurung, the father of dragons, dear listener, slain at last by the sword of a mortal man, but the sorrow that he had wrought lived after him. So passed the father of dragons, and though his death broke for a moment the back of Morgoth's offensive in those years, the seed of him had already been sown. There were younger worms of his line creeping out from Angband, even in the hour of his death, lesser sons of his cruelty already grown to dreadful size, and none of them had yet been slain. Yet the dragons did not end with Glaurung. They multiplied. They were bred in greater numbers in the years after his fall, and many of them came forth in the long, slow grind of the wars of Beleriand. There were others of his kind, lesser worms, still wingless and creeping, who haunted the northern plains and the bare hills, and who in time would scatter eastward, and from whose line would come, long ages after, the dragons of the withered heath, and the dragons that troubled the dwarves of the iron hills, and at last the great Smaug of Erebor, of whom you have surely heard in other tellings. All of them, dear listener, trace their making back to Glaurung, and through Glaurung to the deep forges of Angband, and through those forges to the will of Morgoth, who could not create but could only mar, and so made even his greatest weapons as twisted copies of fire creatures that should never have been. And yet there came, in the very last hour of the great war against Morgoth, a kind of dragon yet more terrible. For Morgoth, dear listener, when he saw that the host of the Valar themselves had at last come over the sea, and that his armies were being driven back to the very gates of Angband, brought forth a new and dreadful thing from the deepest pits, a thing he had been making in secret against this very hour. He unleashed the winged dragons. And the greatest of them all was Ancalagon, called the Black. Ancalagon, dear listener, was the largest dragon that ever lived in any age of the world. He was so vast that the old tellings struggle even to give a measure of him. His body was longer, the lore-masters say, than the length of a small country. His wings, when he spread them, darkened a whole valley at noon. He was scaled in iron black, and his eyes were furnaces. And his breath was a furnace also, a fire so hot that it could melt stone into running rivers. He was Morgoth's last and greatest making, and Morgoth held him back until the very end, in the very moment when the war was already lost, hoping with this one final terror to turn the tide. And it was a dreadful coming, dear listener. The host of the Valar, the host of the West, marshalled under the banner of the herald Enwu, with the good Maiar in their armies and many a fallen elf spirit in their ranks, had pressed Morgoth's forces back to Thangorodrim, the 3 volcanic towers that crowned the dark fortress. And in that hour, suddenly, the gates of Angband opened, and out of the smoke came the winged dragons, a host of them, and at their head Ancalagon, and the sky was darkened by the spread of their wings as if a great storm had swept up from the north. And they fell upon the host of the Valar with fire and with terror, and the host was driven back, and the war that had been almost won hung suddenly in doubt. But in that hour there came against them, dear listener, a coming of a different kind. For Erendil the mariner, the great seafarer who had sailed at the last to Valinor itself, bearing the Silmaril of Beren and Elthian upon his brow, came down out of the high air in his white ship Vingilot, which had been hallowed and made to sail the sky as it had once sailed the sea. And with Erendil came also the great eagles of Mandu, with Thorondor the lord of eagles at their head, the same Thorondor whose descendants in long age to come would bear Gandalf out of the high lonely places. And there in the sky above Thangorodrim was fought a battle in the air such as the world had never seen and shall not see again, Ancalagon against Erendil, the greatest of dragons against the greatest of mariners, fire against light, the last weapon of Morgoth against the very Silmaril of Fëanor, born upon a mortal's brow. The battle was long, the old tellings say, lasting a full day and a full night of fighting in the high air. But in the end, Erendil prevailed. He struck Ancalagon a mortal blow, and the great dragon fell. He fell from the high air, dear listener, and his body in its falling was so vast that when it struck the earth it broke the very peaks of Thangorodrim, smashing the 3 towers of Morgoth's fortress flat. The volcanoes that had smoked above Angband for an age were broken open in that one collapse. The land itself was changed by the fall of a single creature. And with Ancalagon's fall the heart went out of the winged dragons that yet remained, and the host of the Valar slew the most of them in that same final hour, and the war was won. Morgoth himself was taken at last in the ruin of Angband, dragged out from his deepest pit, bound in the chain Angainor that had bound him once before in the long ago, and cast through the door of night beyond the walls of the world, into the timeless dark from which he had so long sought the flame imperishable in vain. And Beleriand was sunk beneath the sea in the convulsion of that war, the green fields and the high cities, and the long roads and the silver rivers, all the country of the elder days drowned in a single drowning, so that all that lay east of the new coastline of Lindon was lost to the world and to the memory of any but the longest-lived of the Eldar. And the first age came to its end, bought at a price almost too dear to be borne. Yet not every winged dragon perished, dear listener. A few, small in number, lesser in might than Ancalagon, but still dreadful, escaped the breaking of the host. They flew eastward, away from the dying war, away from the falling peaks, away into the wide and untracked lands beyond the misty mountains. And there they hid themselves in the wastelands and the dry places, in the cold north and in the high cracks of the world, and they slept long sleeps and bred slowly, and from their line came the great winged dragons of the later ages, of whom Smaug at last would be the most renowned. Such is the way of the marring of the world. The greatest of the evils are cast down, but the seed of them is never wholly stamped out. Something always escapes into the east, into the dark, into the long ages to come. Now we have spoken of the Mire who fell, and of the spider out of the void, and of the dragons bred in the forges, dear listener. There remains to us in this first telling one more great kind, the most numerous of all the evils of Middle-earth, and in many ways the saddest, because their making is the deepest mystery and the heaviest grief of Tolkien's lore. We turn now to the orcs. And here, dear listener, we must walk with some care, for the matter of the origin of orcs is the matter on which Tolkien himself in his later life never settled. He returned to it again and again, in essay after essay, in letter after letter, and he could never quite find a telling that satisfied him both as a story and as a theology. So let us take the older telling first, the telling that lies in the published Silmarillion, the telling that is in many ways the most beautiful and the most terrible. In that older telling, dear listener, the orcs were once elves. They were of the same kindred as the High Eldar who would one day sing in Valinor and ride to the wars of Beleriand. They were among the very first of Ilúvatar's children, awakened at Quivernan, the Water of Awakening, beside a still lake far in the east of Middle-earth, in the years before there was sun or moon. And when the elves first awoke beside that lake, dear listener, they were alone in the world. The Valar did not yet know of their coming. Ilúvatar had set them in the world as a secret melody, and they had to be discovered. But Melkor, who in those years still wandered Middle-earth in his pride, knew of them first. And he sent his dark spirits and his prowling beasts to take from the edges of the company of the new awakened, to seize them by twos and threes in the night, and to drag them away into the dark. He took them down, the old tellings say, into the pits of Utumno, his first northern stronghold, and there he wrought upon them. He tortured them, he bred them, he bound them in lampless cells and laid upon their spirits a long and patient cruelty over many years, until at last what came forth out of those pits was no longer elf at all. It was a new and broken kind. They had been stripped of memory, stripped of language, stripped of the long inner light of the Eldar, and stamped with a hatred of all things fair, and most of all a hatred of their own lost kindred. They were orcs. And the horror of this older telling, dear listener, is the horror of corruption itself. For if the orcs had once been elves, then the orcs had once been children of Ilúvatar, with souls of the same eternal kind as Galadriel's or Elrond's. And if such a soul could be so bent, so broken, so made into a thing that hated and slew, and could not love, then evil had a deeper grip upon the world than even the wise might have wished to believe. Morgoth had not created the orcs. He had taken something that was made by the One, and he had marred it, and that marring was permanent, and from that marring there came, in time, every orc that ever was. The orcs themselves had no choice in their making. They were born into their broken state, generations of them, multiplying through all the long years that followed. The first slave elves who had been broken in Utumno were long dead in the deep ages, but their corrupted seed bred true, and the orcs went on, multiplying, hating, marching out in numbers that grew with each age. But Tolkien, dear listener, was not content with this older telling, and in his later writings he wrestled with it. He wrestled with it because of a deep theological scruple. For if a fallen creature could be holy without any capacity for redemption, if a whole race could be evil in their very making, with no inward freedom toward the good, then it seemed almost that Melkor had been allowed to create after all, to bring into being a kind of soul that was beyond the reach of Ilúvatar's mercy. And this Tolkien could not accept. The One alone could create. Evil could only mar, never make. So how then could a wholly fallen race have arisen at all? Could Ilúvatar truly have allowed the spirits of elves, his own children, to be so utterly broken that there was no hope at all for any orc? And so he proposed, in his later essays, other tellings. In one of them, he suggested that perhaps the orcs were not from elf stock at all, but from corrupted men, who had been beguiled and bred in the early days after the first awakening of the Edain in the east. For men, he reasoned, were mortal, and the soul of a mortal man did not endure in the world as the soul of an elf did, and so the long bending of men in the pits of Angband would not be so theologically impossible as the long bending of immortal elf spirits would have been. In another telling, he suggested that perhaps the orcs were from elf stock and man stock both, interbred and twisted together in different ages. In yet another, he wondered whether perhaps the orcs were beasts at the root, natural creatures shaped by Morgoth's cruelty into a near likeness of speaking peoples, but without true souls of their own, mere puppets given a counterfeit semblance of personhood by the malice of their maker. He never settled. He died without settling. The published Silmarillion gives us the older telling, the elf stock telling, because his son Christopher had to choose one, and that telling was the most fully developed in the manuscripts as they then stood. But the question, dear listener, lies open at the heart of all the later lore. Where did the orcs truly come from? Were they elves, broken? Were they men, beguiled? Were they beasts dressed up in mockery of speech? And if they were the first, if they were truly elves at the root, then is there in any orc, even the most fallen, some buried spark of the long-lost light of Quivinen, some dim memory of the still lake under the unlit stars, before the dark spirits came? It is a hard question, dear listener. It is perhaps the hardest in all the lore. And we leave it open as Tolkien himself left it open, and pass on. But carry the question with you, if you would, into the rest of this telling. For when you hear of orcs being slain in their thousands at the Pelennor or at the Black Gate, and when the tellers of those tales speak of the slaying with relief, Remember that even there, in the wash of victory, there walks behind the high banners a small and quiet sorrow, the sorrow of what those orcs might have been, before the first dark came down upon their first kindred at the still lake of Quivinen, before any hand had taught them how to hate. And these orcs, once made, multiplied throughout all the long ages that followed, dear listener. They came forth out of Utumno's pits in the first age of the world, and they came forth out of Angband's gates in the second great stronghold, and after the breaking of Angband, they fled into the lesser places, into the misty mountains and the grey mountains and the long ridges of the east, and they bred there in the dark, and they came forth again and again in the slow centuries that followed. They made the misty mountains a place of dread for many an age. They served Sauron in the second age and in the third, and they fought in his wars, and they lingered, dwindled but not destroyed, into the very fourth age itself, the age of the dominion of men. There were many tribes of them in time, dear listener, and many kinds. There were the lesser orcs of the mountain caves, small and crook-backed, who feared the sun and slunk only by night. There were the larger orcs of Mordor, bred in greater frames by the long care of Sauron. And there were late in the third age, the crossbred Uruk-hai of Isengard, larger and bolder still, who could walk by daylight and march for many days without rest, a breed wrought by Saruman in imitation of his old master, mingling, the rumour ran, the blood of orcs with the blood of evil men. So even the orcs themselves were bent and rebent across the ages, mocked by their mockers, twisted from their twisting, refined for greater cruelty by hands that learned each from the last, the marring of the marring of the marring. There was no end to it, dear listener, while any of the dark powers yet had a hand upon the world. But they were not the only horrors of those first dark years, dear listener, for there were also the trolls, hewn out of stone and given a mockery of life, and the great wolves whose breeding ran back into the same lampless pits, and Sauron himself with his many forms and many cunnings, and other things still, lesser perhaps in might but no less strange, that we shall come to in their proper turn. Now of the trolls of Morgoth, dear listener, we must speak next, for they were among the first of the bred horrors that came forth out of the dark furnaces beneath Angband, in the deep pits of that fortress in the north, where the great Valar Morgoth had set his throne, and where the air itself was made foul with the smoke of forges that never cooled. The Dark Lord laboured long upon the shaping of such creatures as might walk the open lands of Middle-earth and break the strength of his enemies by sheer weight of brute and mindless power. And of these bred things, the trolls were among the earliest, and among the cruelest, and among the most loathsome to look upon, for they were wrought, so the wisest of the Eldar afterward held, in mockery of the Ents, those ancient tree-herds of Yavanna, who walked the woods of the world and tended the growing things. As the Ents were tall and slow and full of the green wisdom of the forest, so the trolls were tall and slow and full of nothing but malice and hunger. As the bark of the Ents was hard and patient against the weathers of the world, so the hide of the trolls was hard as stone and patient against the blades of swords. And as the Ents spoke in the long rolling tongue of growing things, so the trolls grunted and roared in a coarse speech that was scarcely a speech at all, and could utter little more than threats and demands for meat. The greatest of these were the mountain trolls, dear listener, vast and shambling figures of the high places, 15 feet and more in height when they stood upright, with shoulders broad as the doorways of houses and arms long enough to drag upon the ground. Their hide was as the grey stone of the mountains in which they dwelt, and so thick and tough that no ordinary blade could pierce it, and many a spear was turned aside upon their flesh, as though it had struck a wall of granite. Their faces were broad and flat and stupid, with little black eyes set deep beneath jutting brows, and great mouths full of tusks that could crush bone as easily as a hound cracks a marrow. They wielded as weapons whatever came to their hand, uprooted trees, slabs of stone, hammers of crude iron forged for them by the orc-smiths of Angband, and where they walked, the earth was trodden flat, and the works of men and elves were broken. Yet for all their dread strength, dear listener, the mountain trolls bore a great and grievous weakness, set upon them by the very nature of their making in the dark places of the world, and that weakness was this: they could not abide the light of the sun. The first trolls of Morgoth had been bred in the lightless deeps, and the unhindered rays of Anar, the great lamp of the sky kindled by the Valar from the last fruit of the dying tree Laurelin, were poison to their flesh and ruin to their substance. Some lawkeepers have said that those first trolls, when caught by the dawn in the open lands, were turned wholly into stone, frozen forever in whatever posture they had held at the moment the sun touched them, and that great standing stones in lonely places of Middle-earth were in truth the petrified bodies of such creatures, caught at their morning flight and never released. Others have said it was not so total a working, that the trolls were only made senseless by the light, their wits dimmed, and their limbs grown sluggish and useless, so that they could be slain easily by any warrior bold enough to draw near, though their bodies remained yet of flesh. Whichever the truer telling, this much is certain, that in the elder days, no mountain troll would willingly leave its cave, or its overhang, or its deep ravine while the sun rode in the sky, and the raids of trolls were ever raids of the night, and at the first paling of the eastern horizon they would flee back beneath stone with great haste and much cursing. In the long ages that followed the fall of Morgoth at the end of the First Age, dear listener, the trolls did not pass from the world, for though their master was cast out into the void beyond the walls of night, the things that he had bred remained, and crept on through the centuries in the broken places where the works of his ruin still endured. In the Second Age, and into the Third, there came forth the cave trolls of the misty mountains, and of the dark hollows beneath the arid Mithrin, smaller than their mountain troll kin but no less savage, dwelling in the deep delvings that the dwarves of old had abandoned, feeding upon whatever blundered into their reach. It was such a one, in the great underground halls of Moria, that the Fellowship of the Ring would in later days encounter, when its grey-skinned bulk came hammering through the eastern door of the chamber of Mazabul, with the orc host howling behind it, and the chronicles tell that even Boromir's stout sword and Aragorn's blade could scarce mark its hide, until Frodo's small thrust with the elven blade sting found a chink at its foot. In the far north, beyond even the cold of Foracle, there dwelt the snow trolls, dear listener, white-furred and shaggy creatures grown to the color of the eternal ice in which they made their lairs, hunting the seals of the frozen shore and the great white bears of the northern wastes, and only seldom troubling the lands of men, for those lands lay far to the south of their hunting grounds. Yet now and again, when some great cold came down upon the world, and the snows pressed further south than was their wont, the snow trolls would follow, and the lonely settlements of the Bay of Foracle and the cold marches of Forodwaith would find their flocks and their kin taken in the long nights. The Lossoth, those quiet folk of the northern ice who built their houses of frozen turf and rode upon sleds drawn by hounds across the white plains, knew the snow trolls well, and feared them above all other dangers of their cold world, and they had songs and warnings to ward them off, and certain marks set upon the lintels of their houses that the snow trolls would not willingly cross, though whether those marks held any virtue beyond the courage they gave to the men within, no chronicler has ever certainly known. And there were yet other kinds of troll, dear listener, that the lore-masters have spoken of more dimly, the stone trolls of the high moors of Eriador, smaller than the mountain trolls and somewhat quicker of wit, who spoke in a rough common speech that they had learned from the men they had robbed and eaten, and three of whom, named Tom and Bert and William in the rude fashion of their kind, were famously turned to stone by the trick of Gandalf the Grey upon the road east of the last bridge, when the company of Thorin Oakenshield first set out for the lonely mountain. Their petrified figures still stood, the chroniclers say, in the troll shores beside the road for many a long year after, gathering moss upon their stone shoulders and offering shelter to the small birds in the hollows of their open mouths, as silent witnesses to the old weakness of their kind under the touch of the morning sun. But of all the trolls, dear listener, the most terrible were those that came forth at the last in the latter days of the Third Age, when Sauron the Dark Lord, once the chief lieutenant of Morgoth, and now his successor in dominion had returned in strength to his black tower of Barad-dûr in the land of Mordor. For Sauron, who had learned much in the long ages of his exile and his crafty labors, took up again the breeding pits that his old master had abandoned, and there in the heat and the foul vapors of Mount Doom's lower slopes he set about the improving of the old stock. And the new breed that he brought forth was called by the dark speech of his realm the Olog High, which is to say in the common tongue the troll folk, and they were a thing of dread surpassing all that had come before. For Sauron had bent his great will upon the question that had ever vexed the trolls of Morgoth, the matter of the sun, and by some craft of breeding and of dark sorcery, the workings of which no good chronicler has ever set down, he made of the Olog High a creature that could endure the light of day and walk abroad in the noon without flinching. They were of the great mountain troll stature, 15 feet and more, with the same stone-hard hide and the same tusked maws, and the same brute strength to break walls and crush men beneath their feet, but their wits, though still slow and cruel, were somewhat sharpened to the use of weapons of war, and their tongues, the chroniclers note, were black as pitch, a mark by which they were known apart from their elder kin. They bore the great round shields, and the long hammers of the armies of Mordor, and in the last assault upon the gate of Minas Tirith, and again in the final battle before the Black Gate, they marched in the foremost ranks of Sauron's host, and many a brave man of Gondor and of Rohan fell beneath their hammers before the day was done. Now from the trolls, dear listener, let us turn to another and yet more ancient horror of the breeding pits, to the great wolves of Angband, and chief among them to Draugluin, who was the sire of all that line. For in the dark ages of the First Age, when Morgoth still held the north in his iron grip, and his fortress smoked upon the horizon of Beleriand, there came forth from those pits the first of the werewolves, which the law-keepers count as a creature apart from the wolves of nature, for they were not born of beasts alone, but were beasts into which the Dark Lord had poured something of his own foul will and the will of his bound spirits. Of these first werewolves, the greatest and the eldest was Draugluin, a vast and grey furred horror with eyes like coals and fangs like swords, and he was held to be the very father and progenitor of all the great wolves that afterward troubled the world. The chronicles of the Quenta Silmarillion tell that Draugluin was given as a thrall and a creature to Sauron, who in those days was still the chief servant of Morgoth, and held in fief the dread isle of Tol Sirion, which after Sauron's coming was named Tol in Gorhoth, the Isle of Werewolves. And beneath the towers of that fortress, in the dripping caverns and the foul kennels that Sauron had delved in the stone of the island, Draugluin made his lair, and from his loins came forth a long and wretched line of great wolves, each bred for cunning and for cruelty, each filled with such measure of fell spirit as the Dark Masters could pour into them. These wolves stood larger than any natural wolf, with shoulders that came to the breast of a tall man, and they could speak after a fashion in the black tongues of their masters, and they hunted not from hunger, but from malice, and they took prisoners as well as prey, dragging the captured back to the pits of Sauron for the working of his will upon them. In the long tale of the Silmarillion, dear listener, you may read how Draugluin came to his end, and it is a tale worth the telling. For there came to the gates of Tol in Gorhoth in those days the elf lord Beren son of Barahir, and with him the king's daughter Elthian Tinviel, fairest of all the children of Ilvatar, and with them also there came the great wolfhound Huan, a noble beast of the hunting pack of the Valar, set free of Valinor by the Prince Celegorm and bound by fate to a single doom, that he should die only in combat with the mightiest wolf that ever walked the world. And Sauron, hearing that strangers had come to the bridge of his isle, sent forth his wolves one by one to slay them, and one by one Huan slew the wolves of Sauron, until at the last Sauron sent forth Draugluin himself, the greatest of his pack, and the sire of all that bloodline. And there upon the bridge of Tol Sirion the two great beasts fell upon one another, and the bridge ran with their blood, and for all his fell strength and all the foul spirit that quickened him, Draugluin was overborne at the last by the noble hound of the Valar, and he fled back broken into the chambers of Sauron, and gasped out at his master's feet the news of the doom that was come upon him, and then died upon the cold stones. Yet though Draugluin himself was slain, the line of werewolves that he had sired did not perish with him. The chronicles tell that his descendants continued through the long wars of Beleriand, and even after the breaking of that land at the end of the First Age, when the great war of wrath sank the western shores beneath the sea. Some few of his line, the law-keepers held, escaped eastward into the wilderness of the rising sun, and there bred in the cold and lonely places, and from them in the long ages there came other werewolves, lesser than their sire, but still dreadful, into whose flesh evil spirits had been clothed by the lingering arts of Sauron and his disciples. For this was the nature of the werewolf, dear listener, as the wisest of the lawmasters understood it. It was not merely a great wolf, but a wolf body inhabited and ridden by a fallen and unhoused spirit of the dark, one of the many lesser Maiar, and yet lesser servants of Morgoth, who had taken upon themselves the shapes of beasts, and could put them on and off, as a man might put on and off a cloak. So in slaying a werewolf, the warrior slew not only flesh, but also bound and undid a spirit of malice, and this was held to be a deed of great virtue, though one not lightly attempted. And now, dear listener, we come to a wolf greater even than Draugluin himself, the greatest wolf that ever was bred in any pit of Morgoth, and his name was Carcharoth, which in the elven tongue meant the Red Maw. For Morgoth, after the death of Draugluin and the breaking of the Isle of Tol in Gorhoth, foresaw that thieves and adventurers might yet come to the very gates of his fortress in the north, drawn by the great gems called the Silmarils that he had set in his iron crown. And he resolved to breed up a guard such as the world had never seen, a wolf of such stature and such ferocity that no creature, however bold, might pass him living. So he chose out the strongest whelp of Draugluin's surviving line, and he gave him into the keeping of the most cruel of his thrall-masters, and from the very hour of his whelping the wolf was fed only on living flesh, for it was the dark teaching of those breeders that a creature so nourished would grow stronger and crueler than any fed in the manner of common beasts. And so the years passed, and the whelp grew, and his bulk swelled until he was larger than any wolf that had walked the earth before, and his teeth grew long as daggers, and his eyes burned with a red and lightless fire, and Morgoth himself was said to have come down from his iron throne to look upon him, and to breathe upon him his own dread spirit, and to set him at last as the warden at the very gates of Angband, lying full length across the threshold so that none might pass into or out of those gates without his leave. And it was at this guard, dear listener, that Beren and Elthian were forced to come at the climax of their long and weary quest for the Silmaril. For after the breaking of Tol in Gorhoth and the rescue of Beren from Sauron's pits, the two of them set forth disguised. Beren in the hide of the slain Draugluin himself, taken as a trophy from the Broken Isle, and Elthian in the cloak of feathers of the bat fell Thuring-Wethiel. And in this guise they came at the last to the gate of Angband, where Carcharoth lay watching. The great wolf was deceived for a moment by the scent of his sire upon Beren, but his suspicion grew, and Lilthien cast upon him at the last a deep enchantment of sleep, and so they passed within. And there in the throne hall of Morgoth, after long and terrible labours, Beren cut a single Silmaril from the iron crown of the Dark Lord, and they fled. But as they reached the gates once more, dear listener, Carcharoth had wakened from his enchanted slumber, and he stood athwart their path with a hunger and a fury beyond all reason, for the spell upon him was breaking, and he sensed the great prize that they bore. And Beren, in a moment that the lawmasters have called both brave and foolish, held forth the Silmaril before the wolf's eyes as a holy thing that might daunt the beast, thinking perhaps that the hallowed light might overawe the fell spirit. But the wolf, who knew no awe of any holy thing, snapped his jaws upon Beren's hand and bit it off at the wrist, and swallowed both the hand and the Silmaril together. And then a worse fate came upon him, for the hallowed gem was poison to all evil flesh, and it began at once to burn him from within with a fire that no water could quench and no flight could outrun, and Carcharoth went mad with the agony of it. And he tore loose from the gates of Angband and went howling and ravening southward, and his coming was a terror across all of Beleriand. He slew all that crossed his path, beasts and elves and beasts of the wild together, and the lands through which he passed were laid waste. And at the last he came in his madness even to the wood of Doriath, the guarded realm of King Thingol, where the girdle of Melian had until that hour kept all evil out, but the holy fire in his belly burned through even her enchantments. There in the woods of Doriath, dear listener, the last hunt was prepared. Thingol himself and his lord huntsmen, Mablung and Beleg, and Beren, who had returned from the north grievously maimed but unbroken in spirit, and the hound Huan, who had returned also from his long wanderings, all of them went forth into the green wood seeking Carcharoth, and at the last they came upon him by a dark pool. And there the wolf and the wolf-hound met for the second time in their lives, for Huan was the very hound that had broken Draugluin upon the bridge of Tol in Goroth, and he it was who had been fated to die in combat with the mightiest wolf that ever walked. And so the prophecy was fulfilled in that grim hour, for Huan slew Carcharoth, tearing out his throat with his great fangs. But Carcharoth in his death agony struck back and gave Huan also a mortal wound, and the noble hound of the Valar, who had spoken only thrice in his life with the speech of mortal tongues, spoke at the last his farewell to Beren, and laid down his great head and died. And from the belly of Carcharoth they cut the Silmaril, and Beren bore it broken in his other hand to King Thingol, and so ended the greatest of all the wolves of Angband, and the noblest of all the hounds of the Valar, in a single hour of grief and triumph together. Now from these elder wolves, dear listener, the chroniclers turn their eyes forward into the latter ages, to the wargs of the Third Age, which were not werewolves in the old and dreadful sense. That is, they were not bodies inhabited by fallen spirits, but were rather a breed of great and evil wolves descended in some measure from the line of Draugluin, scattered eastward in the breaking of the First Age, and bred up again in the wild lands of Ren and the dark valleys behind the misty mountains. The wargs were larger than any natural wolf, with shoulders that came to the chest of a tall man, and their pelts were dark and matted, and their eyes glowed yellow in the dusk, and their fangs were long and yellow as old ivory. But more than their bulk, what set the wargs apart from common wolves was the quickness of their wits and the cunning of their hunting, for they were intelligent in a measure that no ordinary beast attained, and they could plan and remember and bear grudges. And they spoke among themselves in a snarling tongue of their own that the orcs of the misty mountains had partly learned and could partly answer. For the wargs and the orcs of those mountains had entered, in the long centuries of the Third Age, into a strange and dreadful companionship, dear listener, not the friendship of equals, for there was no friendship in either heart, but a working alliance in which each made use of the other for the better hunting of common prey. The orcs rode upon the backs of the wargs, as cavalry rides upon horses, and the wargs carried them swiftly through the high passes and the long ridges where no horse could go, and together they harried the merchants and the travellers who dared the eastern road, and together they fell upon the lonely homesteads of the wilder lands and the herds of the men of the vales. The packs of wargs ranged from the cold peaks of the grey mountains in the north down to the gaps of Rohan in the south, and there was no high pass of the misty mountains that was not in some season their hunting ground, and many a traveller perished in the snow with the yellow eyes of the wargs about him in the night. The chieftains among them, the largest and the eldest of the warg packs, were spoken of in the chronicles as the warg lords, and they were said to have a measure of wit nearly equal to that of the great orcs themselves, and to hold council in their high places beneath the moon, where they would gather upon a flat stone or a rounded clearing and bay their plans to one another in their snarling tongue, and the orc chieftains would come and listen, and bargains were struck, and prey was divided, and the long hunts of the next moon were appointed. The wargs remembered grudges across generations, the chroniclers say. A horseman who slew a warg in his youth might find that wargs grown whelps waiting upon the road for him in his old age, and the great elf host that came through the high pass in the Second Age was harried for 200 years afterward by a particular pack that remembered the slaughter of its sires. It was such a pack, dear listener, that fell upon the company of Thorin Oakenshield in the days when the Dwarf King and his 13 kin went forth from the Shire with the wizard Gandalf and the burglar Bilbo Baggins, seeking the Lonely Mountain and the recovery of the treasure that the dragon Smaug had stolen long before. For as they crossed the high passes of the misty mountains and came down upon their eastern slopes, they were caught in a clearing among great pines by a gathering of the wargs, and the company was driven up into the branches of the trees, and the wargs prowled below with their tongues lolling and their jaws snapping, and the orcs came running to join the hunt, and only the timely coming of the great eagles of the north saved the company from a foul and final ending. And in the War of the Ring that came after, dear listener, the wargs were again at the service of the dark. They ran with the orcs of Isengard in the chase after the riders of Rohan, and they fell upon Aragorn and Gandalf and Theoden in the wild lands as the host of Rohan rode toward Helm's Deep. And many of them were slain in that fight, but many more remained, and they served Sauron faithfully in the only fashion that such beasts could serve, until the very end of his power. And now, dear listener, we must turn to a horror of another kind altogether, to the great spiders that dwelt in the dark heart of Mirkwood in the Third Age, and to trace their lineage we must look back once more to the very beginning of our long tale, to Ungoliant, that ancient and terrible spirit of unlight, who in the dawn of the world had drunk the light of the two trees, and grown thereby to such bloated horror that even Morgoth had feared her. For though Ungoliant herself, as the wise have told, devoured at the last her own substance in the wastes of the south, and so vanished from the world, she left behind in the high passes of the arid Gorgoroth, the mountains of terror, upon the northern marches of Doriath, a brood of children, lesser than herself in stature, but inheriting in measure her foul appetite and her dark cunning. And these in their turn bred and multiplied, and crept down out of the mountains in the long ages, and spread eastward and southward across the lands. Now of this brood, the greatest that survived into the Third Age was the great spider Shelob, of whom we shall speak more fully in the chunk to come, for she dwelt in the high pass above Minas Morgul, and there bore her own foul children. But other and lesser descendants of Ungoliant came in those same ages into the great wood that was once called Greenwood the Great, the vast forest that stretched from the Anduin in the west to the marches of Dale in the east, and that had been in the early Third Age a fair and sun-dappled wood, beloved of the sylvan elves. But when Sauron, in his guise as the necromancer, came up into the southern reaches of that wood, and built there the dark fortress of Dol Guldur, a shadow fell upon the green leaves and the bright clearings, and the trees grew tangled and black, and the streams ran turbid, and many ill things came creeping in from the wastes to dwell beneath that shadow. And among them came the great spiders, descendants of Shelob's elder kin, drawn to the gloom as moths are drawn to a candle. In the dark heart of the wood, dear listener, which men in the later days called no longer Greenwood but Mirkwood, the spiders made their colonies, and they grew there to a stature far beyond that of ordinary spiders, some of them as large as ponies, with bodies black and bloated and hairy, and many legs jointed sharp as scythes, and many eyes that glittered with a wicked intelligence, for these were no mere brute insects, but creatures with something of speech and something of malice in them. They spun their webs from tree to tree across the dim paths of the wood, webs of strands as thick as cords and as strong as rope, and any creature that blundered into those webs was bound fast and stung into a stupor and hung up for the slow feeding. They spoke to one another in a hissing speech of their own, the chroniclers tell, in voices that hobbits and dwarves alike could partly understand if they listened close, and their talk was ever of meat and of dark business and of grudges among themselves. It was through this wood, And into the very midst of these spiders, dear listener, that the company of Thorin Oakenshield came in the days of their long journey to the lonely mountain, bereft of the wizard Gandalf, who had departed on other errands and warned strictly by the elves of the wood realm to keep to the path and never to stray from it. The dwarves, nevertheless, wandered from the way in their hunger and their bewilderment, and they were taken one by the spiders and hung in webs from the branches of the trees, and only the small burglar Bilbo Baggins, by the virtue of the ring he had taken in the deep places under the mountains, escaped capture. And it was Bilbo, the smallest and least of the company, who in that hour proved his worth, for he taunted the spiders and drew them away from his bound companions with cries and with thrown stones, and then crept back and cut the dwarves down one by one from their bonds. And so the company was saved, though hardly, and they came at the last to the doors of the Elven King's halls. The webs of the Mirkwood spiders were a wonder of foul craft in themselves, dear listener, and worth the speaking of. They were spun not in the simple wheels of an ordinary garden spider, but in great tangled curtains and corridors that draped from bough to bough across whole reaches of the forest, sometimes for furlongs at a stretch, until certain quarters of the wood were rendered wholly impassable to any creature without wings or without a sharp blade. The strands themselves were grey and sticky, and so strong that even a full-grown stag could not break them with all its struggling, and they were so cunningly placed across the dim paths that travellers blundered into them before they could see them in the gloom. And once a creature was bound, the spiders came creeping down from above with a soft whispering of many legs, and they wrapped the prey round and round in further bindings until it could not move at all, and then they pierced it with their fangs and pumped into it a venom that did not kill but only stupefied, so that the prey hung living for many days in the larders of the spider colonies, and was fed upon only when the spider hungered, leisurely and at length. It was this most dreadful fate from which Bilbo cut his companions free, dear listener, and the lore-masters reckon that had he come a day later, the spider's venom would have set so deeply that no rousing might have wakened the dwarves at all. For the spiders, dear listener, for all their malice and all their cunning, did fear the realm of the elven king Thranduil, who held court in the great caverns of the north of Mirkwood, and they did not willingly come within the bounds of his guarded land. For the elves were ancient enemies of all the brood of Ungoliant, and they hunted the spiders with bow and with spear whenever they ventured too near, and the spiders, for all their numbers, had not the courage to challenge the long spear and the keen sight of the sylvan archers. So the colonies of the spiders kept to the southern reaches of the wood, near the shadow of Dol Guldur, and only ventured north when hunger drove them, and the path that ran through the wood was kept passable, though only barely, by the watchfulness of the Elven King's folk. Now we leave the bestial horrors, dear listener, and turn to creatures of another and a darker order altogether, to the Nazgul, the 9 ring-wraiths, who were not beasts at all in their origin, but had been once the kings and lords of men, and who, in the slow corruption of the rings of power, had been reduced from living men to undying shadows. For their tale begins in the Second Age, when Sauron, who was then still able to wear a fair and seeming form, came among the elven smiths of Eregion, and taught them the craft of the rings of power, and through them was forged the great sequence of rings, 3 for the elves, 7 for the lords of the dwarves, and 9 for the kings of men, and 1, the master ring, that Sauron forged in secret in the fires of Mount Doom to be the binding and the dominion over all the rest. The 9 rings, dear listener, were given by Sauron to 9 mortal kings of men of the Second Age. 3 of them were great lords of the men of Numenor who had fallen away from the friendship of the elves and into pride and the love of power, and the others were kings and sorcerers of the eastern lands, men of high lineage and great wealth, men who were already half corrupted by the long service of dark masters, and who took the proffered rings with eagerness. And the rings did all that Sauron had promised them. They gave to their bearers long life, far beyond the years of mortal men, and they gave to them riches and dominion, and the seeming of glory, and they gave to them also a measure of the power to walk between the seen and the unseen worlds, and to read men's hearts at a glance, and to compel the obedience of lesser folk. But the price of these gifts, dear listener, was slow and terrible. For the rings worked upon their bearers as a slow poison works upon the body, at first imperceptibly, then with growing strength, and at the last with utter ruin. The kings of men, year by year, and decade by decade, and century by century, were eaten away from within. Their bodies, which had been at first only preserved by the rings against the ravages of age, became at the last so thinned and so faded that they passed out of the seen world altogether, and their flesh was visible only by the cloaks and the armor they had set upon themselves before the change came upon them. Their wills, which had been, at first, only inclined toward Sauron's bidding by the subtle pull of the rings, became at the last wholly bound to his. They could think no thought that was not in some measure his thought, and could do no deed that was not in some measure his deed, and they were knit to the master ring as the fingers of a hand are knit to the wrist. And so they were no longer men but wraiths, undying and unliving together, and they were called the Nazgul, which is the name in the black speech of Mordor, and the Ulairi in the high elven tongue, and the ring wraiths in the common speech of men. To look upon them in the seen world, dear listener, was to look upon a hollow, a black cloak and a black hood that held no face, a pair of black gloves and a pair of black boots that held no flesh, mounted upon a great black horse whose nostrils smoked and whose eyes burned red. But to look upon them in the unseen world by the virtue of an elven gift or by the wearing of the one ring was to look upon their true forms, pale figures of kingly bearing with grey hair and white faces and hollow eyes, robed in the tattered raiment of their long-vanished kingdoms, bearing crowns and swords that yet shone faintly with the ghosts of the splendor they had once possessed. They were neither living nor dead, the lore-masters held, but trapped between, and the only path that yet remained to them was the path of Sauron's bidding, for they could not lay down the rings without the unmaking of the Master Ring, and the Master Ring was hidden from them for many an age. The breath of the Nazgul, dear listener, was a thing of dread by itself, and it was called by the men of Gondor the Black Breath. To stand near a ring wraith was to feel the courage drain out of the heart and the warmth out of the limbs, and to be touched by their cold blades was to be poisoned with a wound that would not heal by the ordinary arts of leechcraft, but required the hands of the king himself by the old prophecy of Gondor. For the hands of the king are the hands of a healer. Those struck by the Black Breath fell into a swoon from which they did not easily wake, and even when they did wake, the shadow of it lay upon them for many days, and some never wholly recovered. The mere passing of a Nazgul over a town in the night was enough to chill the dreams of every sleeper beneath its shadow, and dogs howled, and horses screamed in their stables, and children woke weeping without knowing why. There were 9 of them, dear listener, and the lore-masters have set down what little they could gather of the names and the histories of those 9 before their fading erased all memory of who they had been. 3, as we have said, were of Numenor, and one of these 3, the chief and the eldest, was held by the deepest of the law-keepers to have been a great king of that drowned land, a man of high lineage and surpassing pride, who had grown so weary of the brief measure of mortal years that he had reached for Sauron's gift with both hands, and would not let it go. The other 6 were of various eastern and southern realms, sorcerer kings of the dark men, lords of the Variags and the Easterlings and the black Numenorians of men whose names were already half forgotten, even in their own kingdoms, by the time their fading was complete. And once the rings had eaten them through, no name remained to any of them but the title of their bondage. They were the 9, the ring wraiths, and what they had been they could not themselves remember. After the fall of Sauron, at the end of the Second Age, dear listener, when the last alliance of elves and men cast down the Dark Tower and Isildur cut the one ring from Sauron's hand, the Nazgul too were unmade for a season, for without the will of their master to sustain them, they faded back into the shadows from which they had come, and were not seen in the world for many ages. But when Sauron at the last returned, and when his will gathered itself again in the dark tower of Dol Guldur, and afterward in the rebuilt Barad-dûr, the Nazgûl too returned, and they took up their old places at his side, and they were given new tasks in the long preparation for the recovery of the Master Ring. They dwelt for long ages in the dead city of Minas Morgul, which had once been Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Rising Moon, a fair city of Gondor that the Nazgûl had captured in the wars of the early Third Age and made into their own foul abode. And from Minas Morgul they rode forth on their dark errands, and the very mention of their approach was enough to empty villages along the road. In the Great War of the Ring, dear listener, the Nazgûl were unleashed in their full strength for the hunting of the One. They rode forth from Mordor in the guise of black riders upon great horses, and they crossed the Anduin and came into the lands of Eriador, seeking the bearer of the ring, and they came at the last into the very Shire itself, and they pursued the hobbit Frodo Baggins through the wild lands to the very ford of Bruinen, where they were cast down for a season by the floods that Elrond and Gandalf raised against them. But they were not slain, only unhorsed, and their cloaked forms washed away, and they returned at the last to Mordor, and there they were given new mounts, the great fell beasts of which we shall yet speak, and they rode forth again in the latter days as winged terror upon the battlefields of Gondor. Now, of all the Nazgûl, dear listener, the greatest was their lord, the captain and the chief of the Nine, who was called in the common speech of the later Third Age the Witch King of Angmar, for it was in that northern realm that he had wrought his most terrible work in the long centuries before he came south again. Who he had been in his mortal life, the chronicles do not tell with certainty. Some have held that he was a king of the Black Númenóreans of the Southlands, others that he was a sorcerer of the East who had taken a ring early and ruled a hidden kingdom for many centuries before his fading. But whichever the truth, by the time the chronicles take up his deeds, he was already a wraith long fallen into Sauron's service, and his face had passed from the memory of men. In the year 1300 of the Third Age, dear listener, or thereabouts, by the reckoning of the lore masters, the Witch King came forth out of the east and established himself in the cold lands north of the Etten Moors and west of the Misty Mountains, in a realm that he called Angmar, which was to say in the speech of those parts the Iron Home, for he set his fortress in the mountain that was named Carn Dûm, the Red Mountain, and he gathered to himself the orcs of the northern mountains, and the hill men of those wild lands, and he made of all this rabble a kingdom and a dominion, and the purpose of this kingdom, the wise have ever held, was set upon him by Sauron from afar, for it was Sauron's deep counsel to use the Witch King as a weapon against the heirs of Elendil, who ruled the northern kingdom of Arnor, the great realm of the Dúnedain that had been founded in the wake of the fall of Númenor. For 700 years and more, dear listener, the Witch King made war upon the Dúnedain of the north. Arnor in his time had already been divided through the strife of brothers into three lesser kingdoms: Arthedain in the west, with its capital at Fornost; Cardolan in the south, with its capital at Tharbad; and Rudar in the east, the smallest and the wildest of the three, set in the bleak lands between the Weather Hills and the Misty Mountains. And it was upon Rudor first that the Witch King set his hand, for the men of that small kingdom were already mixed with the hill men who served him, and his agents corrupted the royal house. And at the last Rudor fell to him without open war and became a province of Angmar. Cardolan he broke next, dear listener, with a great host that came down upon it from the north and ravaged the lands of the Old Forest and the South Downs, and the last prince of Cardolan died defending the great barrows of Tirn Gorthad, where his ancestors lay. And after that war the barrows were haunted by evil spirits sent forth by the Witch King, the Barrow Wights, who took up residence in those green mounds, and whose chill whisperings would in later days come near to ending the journey of Frodo and his companions on the very road out of the Shire. Arthedain alone among the three kingdoms held out, dear listener, and held out long. King Arvaleg the first fell in battle on the Weather Hills, and the tower of Amun-Sul was thrown down. King Argaleb the second held the line for many years more. King Arafor, the boy king, with the help of Círdan the shipwright and the elves of Lindon, beat back a great assault upon Fornost. But the strength of Arthedain dwindled, and at the last, in the year 1974, the Witch King came forth in his full might, and his host overran the city of Fornost, and the last king of Arthedain, Arvedui, fled north and perished in the icy bay of Foroshel, when the ship that came to bear him away was sunk in the floes. But the Witch King's triumph in the north was short, dear listener, for in the year that followed there came up from the south a great host of Gondor under the captain Eärnur, son of the king Eärnil, and with them a force of the elves of Lindon, and they fell upon the host of Angmar at the field of Fornost. And there the army of the Witch King was utterly broken, and his realm dissolved forever, and the Witch King himself was put to flight by Glorfindel the elf lord, who rode upon him with such fury that the wraith dared not stand. And as the Witch King fled the field, Eärnur would have ridden after him, but Glorfindel held him back, and spoke then the prophecy that would echo down 1,000 years and more, that no man should hew that wraith down, that not by the hand of man would he fall. The Witch King returned south then, dear listener, to Mordor, and there he gathered the other Nazgûl about him, and together they came forth out of the dark land and fell upon the city of Minas Ithil, which guarded the western approach to Mordor. And they took it and made it their own dwelling, and it was thenceforth called Minas Morgul, the Tower of Dark Sorcery. And from that city the Witch King ruled as Sauron's chief captain for many centuries. And when the time came at the last for the great assault upon Gondor in the War of the Ring, it was the Witch King who led the army that crossed the bridge of Osgiliath and laid siege to Minas Tirith. There at the Pelennor, dear listener, the Witch King came at the last to his doom, and the manner of it was such as has been told and sung in many hallways since. The riders of Rohan came down upon the besieging army of Mordor, as a sudden storm comes down upon a summer field, and King Theoden himself led the charge, and the host of Mordor was driven back in confusion. The Witch King rose then upon his great winged steed, and came down upon Theoden, and the king's horse Snowmane fell, and Theoden lay pinned and dying beneath it. And there before the broken king stood his shield maiden, the lady Éowyn of Rohan, who had ridden secretly to war in the guise of a man, and beside her stood the small hobbit Meriadoc Brandybuck, who had been her companion in the road. And the Witch King laughed upon them, and spoke the old prophecy in mockery, that no living man might hinder him. And Éowyn answered with the words that have rung down the ages, that no living man was she, but a woman, the daughter of kings. And Merry, creeping unseen behind, drove his small dagger of Westernesse into the sinew at the wraith's knee, and the dagger, made long ages before by the Dunedain for the very purpose of binding the spirits of Angmar, broke the spell that held the wraith's flesh together. And in that same moment Éowyn drove her sword full into the place where the Witch King's face should have been, and a great cry went up that froze the hearts of all who heard it, and the cloak and the crown and the armor collapsed empty upon the field, and the chief of the Nazgûl, who had ruled 3 kingdoms and broken 3 more, passed at the last from the world. But we have spoken now of the winged steed upon which the Witch King rode, dear listener, and we must say a word of these fell beasts ere we close, for they too were among the horrors of the latter days of the Third Age. What they truly were the chroniclers do not certainly tell, and the lore-masters are divided. They were not dragons, that is sure, for they had no fiery breath, and no hoard greed, and no speech that the wise could hear, and they were not bound by any sorcery to a fixed shape as the werewolves were. Rather, the best of the law-keepers have held. They were the last surviving brood of some forgotten line of winged creatures that had endured from the elder days in some hidden corner of the world, ancient beasts that had nearly perished from Middle-earth, and that lingered now only in lost valleys of the east, where Sauron's seekers had at the last come upon them. They were vast in size, dear listener, larger than any eagle that flew over the western lands, with leathery wings that stretched dark across the moon when they passed overhead, and that made a sound in their beating like the slow tearing of foul cloth. Their bodies were lean and long and naked of feather, their necks snake-like and ever-questing, their heads small and beak-like but armed with no proper bird's beak. Rather, their mouths were full of needle-like fangs set in a slack and toothless jaw, and the breath that issued from those mouths was foul as the air of an open grave, so that men sickened beneath them and horses ran mad. Their eyes were small and red and full of a cold hatred, and they had no warm blood in their veins, but were chill as serpents to the touch. Sauron found them, the chroniclers say, in some hidden valley of the Far East, perhaps in the high mountains beyond the inland sea of Rhun, where they had bred in lightless caves for ages of the world, and he had them brought westward and tamed to the bridle, and gave one to each of his 9 ring-wraiths to ride in the war that came. The taming itself, the lawkeepers note, was no small labor, for the fell beasts were creatures of solitary habit, and would not naturally bear a rider upon their backs, only by the bending of the dread will of the Nazgul themselves, and by long working of dark sorceries within the high places of Mordor, were the beasts brought at the last to suffer the saddle and to answer to the rein. And when they were so broken, they were stabled in the high turrets of Barad-dûr and of Minas Morgul, in eyries open to the sky, where the wind whistled cold among their leathery wings, and the very roof tiles of those black towers were fouled with their droppings and their sheddings, and the appearance of the Nazgul mounted upon these creatures, screaming down out of the clouds upon the battlefields of Ithilien and the fields of the Pelennor, was a thing that broke the hearts of brave men, and many a soldier of Gondor would have fled the field at the first dark shadow had not his captains held him with stern words. The first of these fell mounts to be slain, dear listener, was the one that bore the Witch King himself at the battle of the Pelennor. For when that wraith descended upon the broken King Theoden, the Lady Éowyn, before ever she struck at the rider, set herself before her king's body, with her shield upraised, and as the great beast lunged with its needle teeth at her face, she swept her bright sword in one mighty stroke, and clove the long neck of the fell beast cleanly in two, and the head fell smoking upon the grass, and the body thrashed in its dying upon the field. Only then did she turn to face the Witch King himself, who had been thrown from his saddle by the death of his mount, and there began the duel of which we have already spoken. And in the days that followed the Pelennor, the other fell beasts of the Nazgul were slain in their turn, some by the great eagles of the north when they came down upon the host of Mordor before the Black Gate, and some by other and stranger means, until at the fall of the Dark Tower the last of them perished, and that ancient line passed forever from the world. And now we come, dear listener, to the most particular and named of all the horrors of Middle-earth, to those creatures who were not merely a kind or a breed, but who were each one a singular being set down in a single place in the world, and bearing each one a name that the lawkeepers still remember. And first among these named singular horrors, dear listener, we must speak of the Watcher in the Water, that ancient nameless thing that made its dwelling in the dark lake before the west gate of Moria. For you must understand that the western doors of Khazad-dûm did not always open upon a lake. In the long years of friendship between the dwarves of Durin's folk and the elves of Eregion, there ran clear before that gate the little stream called the Sirannon, the gate stream, and beside it lay a fair green road that wound down from the threshold of the dwarves toward the lands of Hollin, where the elven smiths labored. And in those days, dear listener, the gate stood open more often than not, and there was a coming and going of dwarf folk and elf folk beneath the holly trees, and the silver doors that Narvi the dwarf had wrought, and that Celebrimbor the elf had inscribed with the words "Speak, friend, and enter," were a welcoming threshold, not a hidden riddle. But the long ages turned, as they do, and the elves of Eregion were ruined in the wars of Sauron in the Second Age, and the dwarves of Khazad-dûm closed their gates and delved deeper, and the road that ran beneath the holly trees was forgotten and overgrown, and the little gate stream was left to itself. And in some later age, dear listener, the lore does not tell us precisely when, only that it was long after the first ruin of Eregion, and perhaps even after the fall of the dwarves themselves. Some hand or some heaving of stone, perhaps the malice of orcs who came to dwell about that gate, perhaps the slow settling of the mountain itself dammed the course of the Sirannon, and the little stream that once ran past the doors began to pool, and the pool grew, and the pool became a lake, and the lake became deep, and the lake became dark, and the green road and the holly trees were drowned beneath cold water that lay still and watchful before the silver gate. And in that drowned and stagnant water, dear listener, something came to dwell. The lore is silent on its name, the lore is silent on its kind, the lore is silent on its origin. We know only that it was there, and that it was old, and that it was hungry, and that it had many arms. Some of the wise have guessed that it was a survivor of some older age, a creature that had crept up out of the deep places beneath the mountain when the dwarves had emptied them, drawn perhaps by the slow seep of cold water down through the broken delvings, finding at last a still and lightless pool where it might lie and grow great. Others have guessed that it was one of those creatures that Gandalf himself spoke of when he came up from his long fall into the abyss beneath Khazad-dûm, when he said that far below the deepest delvings of the dwarves the world is gnawed by nameless things, things older than Sauron, things that even Sauron himself does not know, things that have their own slow business in the dark and that pay no heed to the wars of the upper world. And perhaps the Watcher in the Water was one such nameless thing, dear listener, a creeping cousin of those older horrors, come up at last out of its native lightlessness because the upper world had grown dark enough to suit it. Whatever it was waiting on the night that the Fellowship came down out of the snows of Caradhras and stood at last before the silver doors. You will remember, dear listener, how Gandalf labored long to read the riddle of those doors, and how Frodo at last guessed the word melon, the elvish word for friend, and how the great silent doors swung outward upon their hinges. And in the moment of that swinging, when the Fellowship had begun to gather their gear and move toward the threshold, a long pale arm came up out of the still black water of the lake and reached across the narrow strand and closed about Frodo Baggins's ankle and would have drawn him down into the deep had not Sam Gamgee struck at it with his sword, and had not the others seized the ring-bearer and hauled him back from the water's edge. And then, dear listener, the lake boiled, for from the dark below the surface there rose up not one arm but many, 20, perhaps 30, perhaps more, long, pale, snake-like limbs, each one ending in fingers or claws or some terrible feeding mouth, and they came writhing toward the gate as the Fellowship fled inside. And the great silver doors of Durin were forced shut behind them, and the Watcher in its fury did not merely fall back into its water. No, dear listener, the Watcher dragged down great stones and uprooted holly trees and piled the rubble of the cliff face against the closed doors, sealing the western entrance of Moria from the outside, as surely as if it had built a wall of its own dark will. And that, dear listener, was the end of the western road into Moria for many an age. The Fellowship could not have gone back out that way, even had they wished to, for the door was buried, and the Watcher waited in the water beyond. And so the Watcher itself, in its fury, sealed its own lake, for any creature that might once have come to feed it from the upper lands could no longer reach the water, and any traveller who might once have passed that way would find only a heaped ruin of stone where the silver doors had been. The Watcher passed thereafter back into the silence from which it had come, and we hear no more of it in the lore. And it is a strange thought, dear listener, when one pauses upon it, that in the long roll of the bestiary of Middle-earth, this nameless thing in its drowned pool may stand as the very emblem of all the more obscure horrors of the world. It has no name. It has no clear origin. It has no recorded end. It enters the tale for a single moment, takes hold of the heir of the ring by the ankle, and is sealed away again behind a wall of fallen stone, returning to whatever long, slow business it had in the dark before the upper world knocked at its threshold. So much of the deeper lore is like that, dear listener. A brief reaching hand, a brief glimpse of pale fingers in the firelight, and then the silence closes again, and we are left to wonder what kindred of things still lie beneath the holly trees and the cold lakes and the broken roads of the older ages, waiting for some other small folk to come knocking upon some other long-forgotten door. Whether it lives there still in its sealed dark pool beneath the mountain, dear listener, the wise do not say. Perhaps it slumbers yet, its many arms folded beneath the cold water, awaiting some other threshold that will never open. Perhaps it has at last starved and sunk to the muddy bottom of its own prison. Perhaps it has crept back down into the deeper places from which it first came to join its nameless kin in the gnawing of the roots of the world. The lore does not tell. The lore only remembers that it was there, and that it was old, and that for one bright moment beside the silver doors of Durin, it reached out of the dark water and laid its hand upon the heir of the ring. And from the watcher at the gate, dear listener, we must pass within the mountain itself, for there waited a horror older still, older indeed than any creature we have yet named in this long bestiary, save Ungoliant herself and the elder Balrogs, from whom this one was kin. And this is Durin's bane, the Balrog of Morgoth, the last of his fiery race to walk in any form upon the surface of Middle-earth. We have spoken already in the earlier portion of this telling of the Balrogs as a kind, of how they were Maiar spirits in the beginning, drawn down into the service of Melkor in the deeps of time, and of how they were clothed in shadow and in flame, and of how they wielded whips of fire and blades of black iron, and of how they fell in their many at the breaking of Thangorodrim at the end of the First Age. But this one, dear listener, this one Balrog, he did not fall, he fled. He fled when his master Morgoth was cast out beyond the door of night, and his fortress was thrown down, and he came at last in his flight to the eastern side of the misty mountains, and there he crept down and down into the deepest places of the stone, into delving so deep that no sun had ever seen them, and no star had ever shone upon them, and there he laid himself down to sleep, and he slept the long, slow sleep of his kind, and the years and the ages turned above him, and he did not stir. For long and long he lay so, dear listener, while above him in the upper halls of the mountain the dwarves of Durin's folk built their great kingdom of Khazad-dûm, and called it the greatest of all the mansions of the dwarves of Middle-earth. They knew nothing of what slept beneath their feet. They delved their wide halls, and they cut their 21 levels of chambers, and they raised their pillared first hall, and they made the 7 levels above the gates, and the many levels below, and they grew rich beyond the dreams of any people, for the heart of the mountain yielded to them that rare and precious metal which they called true silver, and which we know better by its other name, mithril. And it was in the chasing of mithril, dear listener, in the digging of ever deeper veins, after that bright incorruptible metal, that the dwarves at last delved too greedily and too deep, for they cut down through the bones of the mountain, and they broke open at last the sealed dark chamber where the last Balrog had laid himself to sleep, and they woke him. The lore tells us that this was in the year 1980 of the Third Age, an age of the world long after the Balrog himself had ceased to remember the upper sun, and he rose up out of his long slumber, dear listener, and he was wreathed in his old fire and in his old shadow, and he was wrathful, as only a spirit waked from such a sleep can be wrathful, and he came upward through the delvings of the dwarves like a flame in a stack of dry wood. The king Durin the Sixth he slew in that same year, and Durin's son Nine the First he slew in the year following, and the dwarves who could flee fled, and the dwarves who could not flee perished, and the great kingdom of Khazad-dûm was emptied in a single dreadful season, and the dwarves who escaped called this fiery thing Durin's Bane, for it had slain two of their kings in the line of Durin, and the very name of Moria became thereafter a name of dread upon the lips of all who knew the old tales. And the Balrog, dear listener, was left in possession of the empty halls. And what does such a creature do, alone in the great dark mansion that it has emptied? It seems that for the most part it slept again, for the lore does not tell of any great rampage of Durin's Bane in the years that followed. It seems rather that having driven out the dwarves and having made the mountain its own, the Balrog returned to its slumber in the deep places, stirring perhaps from time to time, ruling perhaps in some shadowy fashion over the orcs that crept in to scavenge the empty halls, but mostly lying still in the dark, untroubled and untroubling. And so it lay for some 1,000 years more, while the world above turned through wars and councils and the slow gathering of the last storm, until, dear listener, the Fellowship of the Ring passed through Moria upon their long road south, and the Balrog woke once again. They came up at the last out of the deep delvings into the great second hall above the bridge of Khazad-dûm, with a host of orcs at their heels and the red light of a coming fire upon the walls. And they saw at last what it was that pursued them. A great shape of shadow, taller than a man, taller than two men, with a mane of flame and a whip of many tongues of fire and a blade of black flame in its other hand. And Gandalf the Grey stood upon the narrow stone span that bridged the chasm of Khazad-dûm, and he set his staff upon the bridge, and he spoke the words that all the world remembers, that he was a servant of the secret fire and wielder of the flame of Anor, that the dark fire would not avail the Balrog, that it could not pass. And the Balrog leapt upon the bridge, and Gandalf broke the bridge beneath it with the striking of his staff, and the Balrog fell. But as it fell, its whip lashed out and caught Gandalf about the knees and dragged him down into the abyss after it. And Gandalf cried, "Fly, you fools," and was gone. And here, dear listener, the lore opens a long, dark door into a tale that very few of the Fellowship ever knew. For Gandalf did not die in that fall, not at once. He fell long, fell down past the lowest delvings of the dwarves and into the older waters that the dwarves had never seen. And there, in a cold, deep lake beneath the bones of the mountain, the Balrog's flame was quenched, and the two of them grappled in the dark water. And the Balrog became a thing of slime, and Gandalf clung to it, though it would have drowned him. And then the Balrog broke from the water and fled, and Gandalf pursued. And up they went, dear listener, up through tunnels that no living creature had ever walked, up through the long sloping passages that the dwarves in their oldest songs had called the Endless Stair, a stair that ran from the deepest foundation of the mountain to the highest pinnacle of stone. And the Balrog kindled its flame again, and Gandalf was hard pressed, and they came up at the last, out of the dark, into the open air, upon the very peak of Zirak-Sigil, the topmost spire of Celebdil the White, with all the world spread far below them, and the clouds turning beneath their feet. And there, dear listener, upon that high cold peak they fought for 2 days and 2 nights of mortal time. The lightning ran upon the stone, the snows of the summit melted in the heat of the Balrog's flame. The waters that ran down from the peak were boiled in the high places, and froze again as they fell. And at the last, in the second dawn, the Balrog of Moria, Durin's Bane, the last of his fiery race upon the face of Middle-earth, was broken upon the stone and thrown down dead from the peak of Zirak-Sigil, and his ruined body fell down the mountainside and brake the stone as it fell. And Gandalf the Grey also fell down dead upon the high snows, his task, as it seemed, accomplished, his errand fulfilled at the last, and his old grey body lay there cold beneath the cold sky. But he was sent back, dear listener, as you know, sent back from beyond the circles of the world for a little while longer, until his task was truly done, and he came again to walk in Middle-earth as Gandalf the White, clothed now in a new garment of light, and the long shadow of Durin's bane was lifted at the last from the bones of the misty mountains. And from the broken peak of Zirac-Sigil, dear listener, we must turn northward, far northward, across the wide lands, to speak of another singular horror of the Third Age, the greatest of his kind to come down to the latter days. And this is Smaug, called the Magnificent, the Golden, the Terrible, the last of the great fire drakes of the north. We have spoken in our earlier portion of the dragons of the First Age, and of Glaurung the father of dragons, and of Ancalagon the Black, whose body in its falling broke the towers of Thangorodrim. Smaug was lesser than these, dear listener, let it be plainly said, for the great dragons of the First Age were a higher and more terrible breed, and even the winged drakes of the War of Wrath were greater than Smaug had ever been. But Smaug was the last, and Smaug was the greatest of those that remained, and Smaug was therefore in the latter days of Middle-earth a horror without rival in his kind, for he stood alone where once a whole brood of his elder cousins had darkened the sky. He was a long, red gold worm, dear listener, with wings broad enough to shadow a town, and a belly armored in the encrusted treasures of a stolen hoard, and a breath of furnace fire that could melt stone. He had eyes of a hot, lidless yellow, and a voice cunning beyond all the cunning of dragons. For the speech of dragons is a weapon almost as terrible as their fire, weaving snares of doubt and of greed about any who hearken to it. Where Smaug had been born, the lore does not precisely say, only that he came forth at some time out of the dragon strongholds in the far north of Middle-earth, in the cold mountains beyond the withered heath, where the few surviving great dragons had bred in secret through the long Third Age, brooding upon old wrongs and waiting for a worthy prey. And in the year 2770 of the Third Age, dear listener, Smaug found his prey, for there had grown up beneath the lonely mountain, the mountain that the dwarves called Erebor, a great kingdom of Durin's folk under King Thror, and there had been mined out of the heart of that mountain a hoard such as the latter days had seldom seen, heaps of red gold and white silver, cups and chains and crowns and helms of wrought metal, gems beyond counting, and at the heart of all the great gem called the Arkenstone, the heart of the mountain that the dwarves prized above any treasure. And below the mountain lay the fair city of Dale, where the men of the north dwelt and traded with the dwarves of Thror, and prospered beside them. And word of all this wealth, dear listener, went out somehow even into the cold places where Smaug brooded, and the great worm came down at last out of the north. He came suddenly, in a flight of fire that lit the northern sky, and he fell first upon Dale, and reduced it in a single afternoon to a smoking ruin of stone and ash, and then he came against the gate of Erebor itself, and burst it inward with the rush of his great hot body, and he slew the dwarves of the mountain, almost to the last man within the upper halls, though King Thror himself escaped by a secret door with his son Thrain, and his grandson Thorin, and a small remnant of his people. And Smaug went down into the great hall of Thror, beneath the mountain, dear listener, and he beheld the hoard, and he loved it, and he made it his bed. He gathered all the gold and the gems and the wrought treasures into one vast glittering heap, and he laid his great long red gold body down upon that heap, and he slept upon it, and the soft gold and the hard gems pressed up into the underbelly of his hide for the long slow centuries of his lying there until they became, as it were, a second armored skin grown into the first. And this, dear listener, was the dragon sleep of Smaug, a sleep not of true rest, but of long brooding, of slow counting of every gem in the heap, of jealous waking at the smallest stir of the air. For a dragon knows its hoard, the lore tells us, as a man knows his own hand. Every cup, every coin, every chain, every gem, the dragon knows them all by their place, and the lifting of any single one will wake the dragon as surely as a blow upon the head. And so Smaug lay upon his bed of gold for nearly 200 years, undisturbed, and the mountain about him was empty, and the orcs and the wolves crept in to make their lairs in the lower passages and gave the great hall a wide berth. And the world above the mountain forgot for a season that the dragon was even there, though the dwarves in their exile never forgot. And the men of the lake town beneath the southern arm of the mountain remembered too, and lived always with one eye turned uneasily toward the broken northern peak. Until at last, dear listener, there came beneath the mountain a small, soft-footed traveller, Bilbo Baggins of the Shire, a hobbit out of his proper depth, who had been carried east by the wizard Gandalf and by the dwarf Thorin Oakenshield and by Thorin's 12 companions, and who had been thrust through a secret door upon the western side of the mountain and bidden to creep down into the dragon's hall and see what might be seen. And Bilbo came down at the last into the great hall, and there he beheld the dragon sleep of Smaug for the first time. The long red gold body, the folded wings, the belly armored in the encrusted gold, the wreathing of smoke from the nostrils even in slumber, the unimaginable heap of treasure on which the worm was bedded. And Bilbo, being a hobbit and therefore brave in his own quiet way beyond what one might guess from his soft feet and his round middle, took up a single cup from the edge of the hoard and crept away. And of course Smaug woke, and of course he flew forth in his rage, and circled the mountain and ravaged the slopes searching for the thief. But the thief had retreated into the secret passage, and the dragon could not find him. And when at the last Bilbo came down a second time, with the ring of invisibility upon his finger this time, there followed the famous conversation between the worm and the hobbit, the long sliding talk full of riddles and false names, in which Bilbo named himself the clue finder and the web cutter and the stinging fly and the friend of bears and the riddle in the dark, and in which Smaug for his part spoke smoothly and patiently and tried to draw out of the small invisible voice the names of his companions and the means of their coming, that he might know whom he should burn first. And in that conversation, dear listener, the great vanity of dragons betrayed itself, as it always does in the old tales. For Smaug, in his pride, rolled upon his back to show the small invisible thief the splendor of his diamond-encrusted underbelly. And Bilbo with his sharp small eyes saw a single bare patch upon the left side of that armored belly, where no gem had grown into the hide, where the hot bare flesh of the worm lay exposed to any arrow that might find that small mark. And Bilbo, dear listener, escaped with that knowledge, and he passed it to the old thrush that perched upon the side of the mountain, and the thrush passed it to Bard, the descendant of the Lords of Dale, who dwelt now in the lake town beneath the southern slopes. For Smaug in his wrath had taken at last to the air, and had flown out against Lake Town, suspecting now that the small thief had come thence, and he fell upon the wooden town, upon the long lake, and set it ablaze with the breath of his fury. And the men of the town fled into the water in their boats, and most of the great archers of the town fell before the dragon's fire. But Bard the bowman stood upon the last standing tower with his last black arrow upon his bowstring, an arrow that had been forged long ago in the smithies of his fathers, and that had never yet failed of its mark. And the thrush spoke into his ear and told him of the bare patch upon the dragon's left side. And Bard drew his bow and loosed the black arrow, and it flew true, and it found that one small bare place beneath the left wing, and it pierced the heart of Smaug the Magnificent, and the great worm gave one last cry and fell from the air and broke the burning ruin of Lake Town beneath his fall, as he came down dead into the waters of the long lake. And so ended, dear listener, the last of the great fire drakes of the north, slain by a single black arrow at the one small place in his armor, betrayed at the last by his own vanity in displaying that armor to a thief he could not see. And there followed upon the death of Smaug the gathering of many peoples to the lonely mountain, the elves of Mirkwood, the men of Esgaroth, the dwarves of Thorin Oakenshield, and at the last the great host of orcs and wargs that came down out of the misty mountains, drawn by the rumour of the unguarded horde. And there was fought beneath the slopes of the mountain that great clash known to the lore as the Battle of Five Armies, in which men and elves and dwarves stood together against the goblin host, and in which the eagles came at the last and turned the tide, and in which Thorin himself fell at the head of his charge, slain among his many slain enemies. But that is another telling for another night. For our purposes here, dear listener, the death of Smaug closes the long chapter of the great dragons in the bestiary of Middle-earth. Some have wondered whether there might yet be cold drakes or lesser worms hidden in the far north beyond the withered heath, even after Smaug's fall. For the wise have said that the dragon strain was not wholly extinguished, only diminished, and that there might still be in the cold high places of the world some lesser kindred of the worm folk, crawling without wings, hoarding without the great fire of their elders, waiting upon some new age of the world. But of such half-rumoured cousins, the lore tells us nothing certain, and we may set them aside as a whisper at the edge of the long bestiary, no more. And from Smaug upon his hoard of gold, we must pass, dear listener, to another singular horror of the Third Age, one no less ancient, and one perhaps more terrible still, for she was not lesser than her elder kindred, but a true daughter of the most ancient evil. And this is Shelob the Great, the last living daughter of Ungoliant the Unlight, the great spider of Cirith Ungol, who made her lair in the high stone pass above the dead city of Minas Morgul upon the western border of Mordor. We spoke in our earlier portion of Ungoliant, that vast spider spirit out of the unlight before the world, who drank the light of the two trees and grew monstrous and was driven at the last into the southern wastes, where she devoured her own brood, and at the last devoured herself. But not all of her brood, dear listener, did she devour. Some few crept away from her in the elder days and hid themselves in the lightless places of the world, and they bred their own diminished children. And from those children came in time the spiders of Nan Dungortheb in the first stage, and from those came in time the spiders of Mirkwood, the troubled Bilbo, and the dwarves upon their road east. And from the elder branch of that brood came also, by some long descent that the lore does not fully trace, Shelob herself, last and greatest of the true daughters of Ungoliant, in whose veins the unlight of the first dark still ran undiluted, and who was perhaps as ancient in her years as anything that yet walked or crawled in the upper world. She had been there, dear listener, in her high stone lair above the pass of Cirith Ungol, since long before Sauron returned to Mordor, since perhaps the latter years of the First Age, when she had crept eastward out of the ruin of Beleriand, and found at last a sheltering cleft in the mountains of shadow that suited her hunger. And there she had lived ever since, in the dark of her tunnels, weaving her webs that were thicker and stronger than any rope of men, hunting whatever creatures wandered up into her pass. Orcs of Mordor for the most part, for she preferred living meat to dead, and the orcs would sometimes drive prisoners up to her threshold as a tribute, and Sauron himself, who knew that she was there, did not trouble to disturb her, for he reckoned her a useful guardian upon that secret way into his land, and called her in his cold, cruel humour his cat, though she served no master save her own slow hunger. She was monstrous to look upon, dear listener, far greater than any of the spiders of Mirkwood, with a body bloated and grey-black and bulging, with many eyes that gleamed with a sick green light in the dark, with great curved horns rising from her head, and with a sting at her tail that was longer than a man's forearm, and that bore upon its tip a venom that could fell any living thing in a single thrust, leaving the victim not dead but in a long, deep, paralyzed allies sleep, that she might bind them and store them and feed upon them at her slow leisure. Her web filled the upper tunnels of her lair and choked the passes through the stone, and any traveller who came that way without warning would find himself wound about in cords that no ordinary blade could cut. And it was into this lair, dear listener, that Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee came at the last in the southward course of their long journey toward the fire of Mount Doom, led thither by the treacherous guidance of Gollum, who had sold them to Shelob in payment for some old service or in hope of some old promise of her leavings. They came up the long stair of Cirith Ungol and into the dark of her tunnels, and the air was foul, and the dark was deeper than any natural dark, and they fled at the last out of the tunnels and toward the high cleft of the pass. And there in the open Shelob fell upon Frodo and stung him in the back of the neck, and he fell down as one dead, and she began to wind him in her cords that she might carry him to her larder. And Sam Gamgee, dear listener, small, soft-footed Sam, who in the long lore of Middle-earth is reckoned among the very greatest of the small heroes, Sam took up the elven blade sting from Frodo's slack hand, and he took also the small star-glass of Galadriel that the lady had given to Frodo at their parting, the glass that held within it the captured light of Erendiel's star, and he stood against Shelob in the open pass, and the star-glass blazed in his small fist as he held it forth, and the light of Erendiel's star was the light of a Silmaril, and the light of a Silmaril is the light of the two trees before they were poisoned, and that ancient light was the very thing that Ungoliant herself had drunk, and that the spider kind in their long descent had hated above all other lights in the world. And Shelob shrank back, and Sam pressed forward with the elven blade, and as Shelob in her greed and her rage tried to crush him with her great body, she drove her own poisoned underbelly down upon the upturned point of sting, and the elven steel pierced her hide where no other blade had ever pierced it, and she was wounded as she had never been wounded in all the long ages of her crawling, and she heaved herself back and rolled away and dragged her ruined body off into the dark tunnels of her lair, and was gone. And whether she lived or died of that wound, dear listener, the lore does not certainly say. Some have held that she crept down at the last into the deep places beneath the mountains to nurse her hurt, and that she perished there alone in the dark, the venom of her own kind running cold in her wound. Others have held that she lived on, slow and wounded and emptied of her old strength, but still hungry, still hidden in some deeper tunnel of those mountains, perhaps even still there in the dark, long after the fall of Sauron and the breaking of his power. The lore does not pronounce. The lore only remembers that on the day of her wounding, the last great daughter of Ungoliant the Unlight was driven away by the light of a Silmaril held in the small fist of a hobbit, and that thereafter she was heard of no more in any tale that has come down to us. And from Shelob in her dark, we must turn outward, dear listener, into the bright and dreadful daylight of the great battles of the latter Third Age, for there were horrors there too, though of a different kind, horrors not of the secret dark, but of the open field of war. And first among these we must name the Mumakil, the great Oliphants of the far south, the war beasts of the Haradrim, those tall dark men out of the burning lands beyond the river Harnen, who came up in the latter wars as the allies of Sauron. The Mumakil were beasts of a kind unknown in the northern lands, dear listener, beasts as tall as 3 trolls standing one upon the other, broader through the shoulder than 10 horses standing side by side, with great curved tusks that came forth out of their mouths like ivory blades, and with long flexible nose arms that could lift a horse and rider together and dash them upon the ground. Their hide was thick and grey, and was reckoned proof against any ordinary arrow, and their eyes were small and red and savage when roused. The Haradrim, dear listener, were a clever and a warlike folk, and they had long known the use of these great beasts in their southern wars. They bound upon the backs of the Mumakil great wooden towers, each tower as broad as a small house, and walled about with stout timber, and within each tower there rode a company of Southron warriors with bows bows and with throwing spears, so that a single Mumak was as a moving fortress upon the field, casting forth death from above as it advanced. And the mere coming of the Mumakil, dear listener, was a terror almost as great as their fighting, for the horses of the north had never beheld such beasts in all their lives, and they would not stand against them, but turned and fled, and even the bravest riders of Rohan and of Gondor found their mounts uncontrollable when the great grey shapes came forth out of the dust. In the battle of the Pelennor fields, before the gates of Minas Tirith, the Mumakil were brought up in great number by the lords of Harad, and they trampled many companies of the riders of Rohan beneath their broad, slow feet, and they cast down the standards of the mark, and they slew with their nose arms and their tusks, and they were very hard to bring down, for an arrow that struck their hide would for the most part glance away, or stick only in the outer skin without piercing to any vital part. They could be slain, dear listener. Eomer's riders did at the last bring down some of them, by shooting at the small red eyes, or by driving arrows into the soft places about the mouth, or by hamstringing the great legs at close quarters at fearful cost. But they could not be easily slain, and they wrought great havoc upon the field before the day was done. And there is one small moment in the lore that has always stayed with me, dear listener, the moment when Samwise Gamgee in the southern wilds of Ithilien, peering down from the company of Faramir's rangers, beheld for the first time in his life a Mumak striding through the trees with its swaying tower upon its back, and he stood frozen in a kind of awe that was almost greater than his fear, for he had heard the old hobbit rhyme about the Oliphaunt all his life as a small child in the Shire, the rhyme that began grey as a mouse, big as a house, and he had thought it only a foolish rhyming bit of nonsense, and now he saw with his own round eyes that the rhyme had been true all along, that there really were beasts in the south as big as houses and grey as mice, and that the world was wider and stranger than any Shire rhyme had quite managed to teach him. And from the Mumakil upon the open field, we must turn to a singular figure who came forth out of the Black Gate itself upon the last day of the war, that strange and dreadful herald whom the lore names only as the mouth of Sauron. He was not a wraith, dear listener, let that be plainly said. He was not one of the nine. He was not undead. He was a man, a living mortal man, but a man so long bent to the service of Sauron that he had become at the last almost more terrible than a wraith, for a wraith is at least a thing that has been overcome, and the mouth of Sauron was a man who had given himself over willingly. He was, the lore tells us, one of those black Númenóreans who had survived the wreck of the old kingdom of Númenor by being already in Middle-earth at the time of its drowning, and who had given themselves to Sauron in the long darkness that followed. He had served in the Tower of Barad-dûr for so long, dear listener, that he had at the last forgotten his own birth name, the name his mother had given him in his cradle, the name by which he had been called as a boy, and he had become only the voice of his master, only the mouth through which the Dark Lord chose at times to speak with the living world. His face was for the most part hidden in the deep shadow of his black hood, and what little could be seen of it was pale and cruel, and his mouth was always smiling, and behind him there was borne the black banner of his master with the red eye of Sauron upon it. He came forth from the Black Gate upon the day that the captains of the West stood before that gate with their small host, having come thither to draw out Sauron's eye, that the ring-bearer might creep unseen toward the mountain. He rode out alone, dear listener, save for his standard-bearer, and he met the captains in the no-man's land between the hosts, and he spoke with the smooth, slow mockery that his long service had taught him. He showed them the mithril coat of Frodo, and the elven cloak, and the short sword, Sting, all taken, so he claimed, from a small spy who had been caught upon the borders of Mordor, and he proposed terms of surrender that were no surrender but a slavery, and he laughed at the small numbers of the West that were drawn up against the gate. But Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, stood forth and looked upon him without speaking a word, and the long wrath of the West was in that look, and the mouth of Sauron, who had been a man, and remembered after all in some buried corner of himself what it was to be a man, broke off his speech and wheeled his black horse and fled back toward the Black Gate. And of his end after that day, dear listener, the lore tells little, only that he was within the gates when the ring went into the fire, and that the gates and the towers and the great host of Sauron fell together in a single ruin, and that the mouth was no more seen. And here at the last, dear listener, before we close this long bestiary, let us gather up a number of the lesser horrors and the more obscure terrors that we have not yet named. For the world of Middle-earth was crowded with such things, and to omit them entirely would be to do the lore some small disservice. First then, the Creban, those great black crows of Dunland that flew in vast wheeling flocks down out of the south, that were no ordinary birds, but rather creatures bent to the will of Saruman the wizard in his treachery, that served him as his far-flying spies, and that came over the wilderness of Hollin in their black hundreds upon the very afternoon that the fellowship sheltered there beneath the holly, sending the company into hiding among the stones and forcing them to abandon the southward road and to turn instead toward the pass of Carcharoth. The Crebain were not perhaps very terrible in themselves, but they were the eyes of a darker mind, and the shadow of their wings was a horror in its proper season. There were also, dear listener, the kine of Aror, those great wild oxen of the far eastern plains beyond the Sea of Rune, the cattle, so the old tales said, of the Vala Orome himself in his wide hunting, descended from beasts that had grazed the lawns of the gods in the elder days, who in the latter age had grown wild and great upon the eastern grass. From one of these, the lore tells us, was cut the great horn of Vorondil that became the heirloom of the stewards of Gondor, and that Boromir bore at his side, and that he sounded at his last stand beside the Anduin. We have no full bestiary of the Keen of Arar. They appear only in passing, as a name behind a name, as the source of a horn that was blown in extremity. But they were there, and they were great, and they were not to be lightly named. There were also the watching stones at the gate of Cirith Ungol, those two black-hewn pillars that stood at the entrance of the high Orc Tower above Shelob's Pass, each pillar carved into the shape of a seated three-headed figure with vulture claws upon its lap, each pillar holding within it some old fell will that resisted the passage of any who tried to come in or go out without permission. Sam Gamgee, when he came up to that gate seeking Frodo, felt their will pressing against him like a wall of cold thought, and he could not pass until he held forth the star-glass of Galadriel and broke the Watcher's will with the elven light. And when he and Frodo at the last fled out again, the Watchers cried with a great shriek of stone behind them, and the tower above came down in ruin. What spirits had been set within those hewn pillars the lore does not certainly say. Perhaps some lesser fell wills of Mordor, perhaps spirits of the air bound there by some old cruel craft of Sauron, perhaps echoes of some older and darker magic out of Mordor's deep past. There were also, dear listener, the dead men of the paths of the dead, who dwelt in the long shadowed corridor that ran beneath the White Mountains, from the upper door at Dunharrow to the lower door at Eric. They had been in their first life, the men of the mountains who in the days of Isildur had sworn upon the great black stone of Eric to come at his call and to fight against Sauron, and who had broken that oath in the hour of need and had hidden themselves in their high holds. And the curse of Isildur was laid upon them, dear listener, that they should not rest until they had fulfilled the oath that they had sworn. And so they did not rest, but lingered as a grey shadow host in the dark passage beneath the mountains for 3,000 years and more, until Aragorn, the heir of Isildur, came at the last to the upper door and entered in unafraid and walked the long dark road through their company, calling them to come forth and to fulfill their oath at the long last. And they came. They came as a grey rushing wind, dear listener, with pale weapons in their pale hands, And they followed Aragorn down out of the mountains and along the rivers and to the haven of Pelargir, where they fell upon the black ships of the corsairs of Umbar, and emptied those ships of their living crews in a single night of pale terror. And at the last, upon the field at the haven, they were released by Aragorn from their long oath, and they passed at the last out of the world of Middle-earth into whatever rest awaits the dead who have at the long last paid their debt. They were not, perhaps, horrors of the same kind as the others in this long bestiary. They had been men once, and they were the wronged of an old curse. But the sight of them was a horror to any living thing that beheld them, and they belong therefore in our long roll. And there were also, dear listener, and here we touch only briefly upon the most shadowed corner of the lore, the things that gnaw at the roots of the world. Gandalf himself, as we have said, came up out of his long fall in Moria with the knowledge that far beneath the deepest delvings of the dwarves there lived nameless things, things older than Sauron, things older perhaps than Melkor's first marring of the music, things that have their own slow business in the dark, and that pay no heed to the wars of the upper world. The lore tells us nothing of their kind, nothing of their number, nothing of their shapes. We have only the wizard's brief word that they are there, and that they are terrible, and that even the Dark Lord himself knew nothing of them. And we have hints elsewhere, old half-songs and forgotten verses, of a kraken shape that brooded in the eastern sea, of a thing called the Mew-lips that the hobbits sang of in a small, foolish song meant to scare the hobbit children, a thing that dwelt in some marsh of the east, and that had cold cellar doors, and that ate the bones of travellers who lost their road. Whether the Mew-lips were a real horror or only a nursery tale, the lore does not say. But the old hobbits sang the song with a certain seriousness, dear listener, as people will do when they suspect that some old word of truth lies hidden in the foolishness of their song. And so, dear listener, we come to the long winding down of our bestiary. We have walked, you and I together, through a great roll of names, through Ungoliant the Unlight at the foot of the two trees, through the Balrogs in their fire and their shadow, through the dragons from Glaurung the Father to Ancalagon the Black to Smaug the Magnificent, through the orcs that were once elves marred, through the trolls that were once stone, through the werewolves of Sauron's old fortress and the wargs upon the eastern slopes, and the spiders of Mirkwood, and the great watcher in the dark water, and the Balrog beneath the mountain, and the daughter of the Unlight in her pass above Mordor, and the great war beasts of the south, and the strange black-robed lieutenant before the gate, and the long shadow host beneath the white mountains, and the nameless things beneath the world. It is a great roll. It is indeed very nearly the full roll of named terrors that has come down to us in the long lore that Bilbo and Frodo and the others gathered into the Red Book of Westmarch, and that we have been given to read. And what shall we say, dear listener, of so long a roll? It is striking, perhaps, that for all the variety of its shapes, fiery, spider-formed, scaled, hooded, winged, four-footed, hewn from stone, riding upon the air, the bestiary is in its essence a single bestiary. Every one of these creatures, when its origin is traced back far enough, is a corruption of something else. The orcs are corrupted elves, the trolls are corrupted in the mockery of the Ents, the dragons are bred by Morgoth from beasts that he had twisted to his will, the Balrogs are Maya spirits, bright servants of the bright powers in the first making, that were drawn down into shadow. Even the Nazgul are corrupted men who took the rings of power and were swallowed by them. Even Shelob is the diminished daughter of a far older spirit that had itself been a thing of pure unmaking. There is no evil in Middle-earth, dear listener, that began as evil. Every horror in this long roll began as something fair, or at least as something neutral, and was bent. Every horror is derivative. Every horror is a songline out of tune in the great music, and the discord, when traced back, comes always to the single hand of Melkor in the beginning, who set the first note out of true and to the hand of his servant Sauron in the latter days, who carried the discord forward in his master's absence. And it is striking too, dear listener, how each age of the world inherits the dregs of the age before. The Balrogs of the first age dwindle to one Balrog in the third. The dragons of the first age dwindle to Smaug in the third. The spider spawn of Ungoliant dwindle to Shelob in the third. Each age, it seems, sweeps most of the elder horrors out of the world, but it never sweeps all of them out, and there are always a few hidden in the deep places, sleeping, waiting, brooding upon old wrongs, ready to come forth into the new age and trouble it once more. Even after Sauron himself is thrown down at the last, dear listener, even after the One Ring is unmade, and the towers of Barad-dûr fall, the world of Middle-earth is not made wholly clean. The Watcher may yet sleep in its sealed lake. The wounded daughter of the Unlight may yet creep in some deeper tunnel. The things that gnaw at the roots of the world go on with their slow gnawing as they have done since before the lamps were lit. The bestiary is not closed. It is only for a season quieted, and that perhaps is the law's last quiet teaching to us, that the great horrors of Middle-earth are mostly the leavings of the choices of a very few, of Melkor at the beginning and of Sauron in his master's stead, and of the lesser servants who lent themselves to those two great wills. The horrors are not native to the world. The world itself, as it came forth from the music of the Ainur, was meant to be fair and was fair, and is still fair in many of its hidden places. But the world has been gnawed, and it remains haunted, even when the gnawing hands have at last been broken by the long, slow leavings of what they wrought in their day. And it is for the small folk of the upper world, for hobbits and for men, and for the elves who still linger, and for the dwarves in their reopened halls, to live among those leavings, to remember them, to name them rightly, and now and then in the dark hour to lift a small light against them, as Sam lifted the star-glass against Shelob, and as Frodo lifted the ring at the last to the fire. And so we end tonight's long bestiary of Middle-earth. May the long roll of these names sit with you in the dark hours, dear listener, a small reminder that even the deepest horrors of the world were once only notes in a song that ran out of true. Farewell for now, until the next path home,